clicked the go live button. Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the U.S. Transhumanist Party Virtual Enlightenment Salon of January 17th, 2021. I am pleased today to host this conversation on seasteading and its implications, the technology of the future that will enable seasteading to hopefully become more widespread and affordable in the coming decade. And with us today, we have our panel of U.S. Transhumanist Party officers and luminaries. Myself, Gennady Stoliarov II, chairman of the U.S. Transhumanist Party, our director of applied innovation, David Shoemaker, our director of visual art, Art Ramon Garcia, our secretary, Pavel Ilin, our foreign ambassador in Spain and technology advisor, Jose Cordero, and our 2020 U.S. vice presidential candidate and advocacy advisor, Liz Parrish. So welcome to our panelists, and our special guest today is an entrepreneur in the field of seasteading, Michael Eliot, the CEO of Ventive Floathouse. So welcome, Michael. We're pleased to have you in our virtual Enlightenment Salon today. And please give an introduction of yourself and Ventive Floathouse and where you see seasteading today, where you see its future prospects.
Thank you, Gennady. Seasteading today, that's becoming a more broad topic. It used to be seasteading was really small. I mean, the Seasteading Institute goes back to about, what, 2010? And here we are 10 years later. And the way seasteading started out, I think, was a lot of big projects, big ideas, and people wanted to jump straight into doing it. And we came up with these amazing big concepts for doing, you know, a $400 million structure way out in deep water. And it's like, we're going to have 1,000 people out there within 3 years. And where seasteading has moved is we've gone through a series of humbling events and we've successively lowered and lowered our ambitions. And I think that's been quite healthy. And what has resulted is a focus on, okay, what can we do now that's small, that's going to work, that's going to bring benefits to people? And can we roll out from there? So we've kind of gone from instead of trying to swim, can we, you know, dog paddle in the shallow end first? And so seasteading today has gone from these big megalithic projects down to focusing on small individual modular structures, and I think that's quite healthy. And in fact, that's basically had been my idea from the beginning when I first heard about it. I first heard about seasteading back in 2011 when I read Snow Crash. It was the first time I've encountered the concept of seasteading. That's a novel, and in that novel they depict a flotilla of boats that are very much connected together. And, excuse me. They're connected together and they travel throughout the oceans and do stuff like that. And they're kind of depicted as a lawless kind of area. But for me, I just thought at the time that it was a really cool idea. Like, I didn't see it as something that could be done. At the time, I was thinking about writing a novel on the side. I thought, hey, this could be a great location for a novel. And so over the next 2 years, I researched it on the side off and on. And the more I researched, the more I realized this is something that can actually be done. And furthermore, I had a background in building houses with my father, and I had started a construction company with a guy back in my 20s. So I had years of experience building, and I said, you know, not only could this be done and would be desirable, but I could actually do it. So at that point, I began investigating what that would look like, what could possibly be done. And that's the origin of Ventive Floathouse. So I began thinking about structures, and my original ideas were to have something maybe cone shaped vertically, because that would be very stable in the water. And I thought about making things on variations of 3D printing, you could say. Like, if there's a shell called or an animal called a turritella, and it creates this circular cone-shaped shell that's very much like that. And it does that by secreting, this hard material successfully. And I thought, well, if we could build something like that, we could build very large structures that were very slowly poured out. A modification of a structure or a building concept called slip forming. And the more I looked at that, I thought, it would work, but it's beyond me at this point. It's like a concept we would do maybe 20 years from now. So I began to think simpler. And I got together a team of volunteers, a couple engineers that work with me for the next couple of years. And we came up with a very simple concept of just a pill-shaped structure that could be built by just a few people on a machine. And we came out all kinds of considerations about size and performance characteristics on the water and what we would have to do to make it useful for people in various ways. So now what I've got is a structure that is 80 feet long, 24-foot diameter, 2 floors, and it would come out to about 2,900 square feet. And we've even done sample floor plans. And the basic idea being that you would be able to sell a house on land and take all your furniture that you have and just move it into a floating house without having to have any major compromises. And it wouldn't even be more expensive than your house. Excuse me.
Yes, thank you, Michael, for that overview. And in the YouTube chat, I've linked to your website, ventivefloathouse.com, and you have a tab there for configurations of various designs that you have, as well as use cases for each of the modules. So, for instance, you could use it as a house, as an office, as a restaurant. Do you believe that the technology to construct these exists today? If you purchased conventionally available materials, had the factory to make these, that there's nothing preventing them from being manufactured, say, next year if you had the resources to do it?
Yeah, the tech is there. And I actually got angel funding last year to start building. And we spent much of this year, or 2020, building, prototyping a manufacturing process for that. And unfortunately, we had planned to have a full-scale demonstrator done by the end of 2020, but COVID threw a wrench in that, and we're still trying to get that on track. So we're probably about halfway done doing that now. But we're regrouping for this year, and going to push forward and have it done this year for sure. The tech is there. The materials are there. It's nothing crazy that needs to exist. We're using, you could use regular concrete. We're using a form of concrete called geopolymer concrete, which does not break down in the ocean water. The ocean water is extremely corrosive to most concretes and most other materials, in fact. But we're using this special geopolymer that does not break down in the ocean water. And we're going to use non-steel rebar so that you don't have any concern with, rusting over time. And that should be able to create a structure that lasts over 100 years at sea, is what I would expect. And because it's a modular structure, we're not just using it for housing. I have a rollout plan for the company that begins with making housing in near ocean water. So, there's already people who live aboard in marinas and stuff like that. So that would be our initial kind of market we would market to. And from there, we would start certifying and building structures that could go into deep water. And one of the rollout plans we have is let's make a prototype city just outside San Francisco as what has been called an H-1B visa sanctuary. One of the big problems that Silicon Valley has is they can't get enough workers because of the H-1B program. And the basic idea behind that is, let's say you're a foreigner, but you've gone to school here, you've gone to college, you've got this advanced degree, you want to start a company, you want to access capital. Well, if you are not a citizen, you cannot legally start a company in the US. and you might not even be able to stay. So you apply for an H-1B visa, and the government only hands out about 65,000 a year. And every year you have about 250,000 people applying for this visa. And it's life-changing for these people if they can stay in the US and start a company, access capital, work here, versus having to go back to a third world country where they have much less opportunity. So we have a group of people that we know we can serve by creating an island or a seastead just outside international waters in San Francisco, still close enough to access capital and workers and start a company on the seastead. Then we could get an actual economy going on the seastead. And to me, that's the thing that's going to mark a truly successful seastead versus something that's just a project or a retirement home, for people. If we can get an organic economy going on a seastead, then it will finance its own growth, and it will draw people from all over the world. It'll be an international city, not a national city, not a state. It'll be somewhere that you don't need a specific visa to move to, or a citizenship or anything like that. It'll be an international city of multiple people. And if you can go there and work, then you can stay, type of thing. And that's really exciting to me. My youth and interest in politics, and what I ultimately reconciled, what I wanted to see done was to have competitive cities set up that would be able to separate who's ruling what or something like that, so that you couldn't blame the other party. It's like when I was a kid, it was like, okay, we have the left blaming the right for why things aren't working, and the right blaming the left. Why don't we give each of them half a city, and then they can't blame each other, type of thing. And that's obviously going to be impossible forever on the land. But on seasteading, we can try it out. We can try different policies in parallel, and whatever works, people can say, okay, that's how I want to live. So it's kind of like freedom from the existing system and a chance to try things that you would not get a chance to do on land. And that's really exciting to me. And the prospect of being able to bring good legal systems to the third world and to people who wouldn't otherwise have access. If we said how many people would move to the US or the first world if we just opened up the floodgates and said, come on in, it'd probably be like, I want to say at least 2 billion people from the third world would try to move to the first world. And mainly what they want is jobs, opportunity, and good legal systems, good institutions. And since there's no chance of the first world opening up, why not bring that to them, is my thought. So I'm looking forward to seasteading being an opportunity to shake things up internationally and to be a beacon of freedom for people.
And that is definitely a promising vision, a vision that I share. Indeed, looking back to 2008, when the concept of seasteading was first formulated by Patry Friedman and Wayne Gramlich, they spoke about jurisdictional experimentation, experiments in governance, as a primary motivator for seasteads to be formed. And as you said, structures could attach and detach if people or a certain subset of people were unsatisfied with governance in a particular community. They could float off to form their own community or join a different community. And that is a peaceful way of resolving tensions. Now, since that time, over 12 years have transpired. And as you pointed out, there have been various developments within the seasteading community that led to a reorientation. The model that I heard you describe is a bit more pragmatic and incremental, in that you're starting essentially in the marina in San Francisco, and you're planning to then expand outward, have this city in international waters for H-1B visa applicants. And that's a great concept. I think it would address, one, the severe problem of housing scarcity in the Bay Area. I'm sure a lot of Bay Area residents might actually appreciate having the option to live in such a seastead community as well. But also it would give immigrants, applicants for these visas, a place to stay that is close enough to the United States that they might benefit from some of the goods and services produced by the American economy. For instance, there could be like a ferry going from San Francisco Bay delivering food or products that these people order, and that would benefit the local economy as well. So I applaud this concept. Now, what do you think motivated this kind of evolution in the strategies pursued by seasteaders from the initial kind of abstract, we want to build these platforms far off in international waters right away with a lot of resources, and then they could be autonomous jurisdictions de facto at the very least, to this more incremental rollout, which you might realize some fraction of and have a viable proof of concept, but still be long before that stage where you really have fully autonomous seasteads way out in the ocean?
Initially, it was money and the scope of projects being just way too huge, and being the scope being so huge and money being so huge that there was just no realistic way to launch it. I mean, that's back when they were talking about planning a structure. This was back when Patrick Friedman was at the Institute. They were planning a giant floating structure with, you know, room for thousands of people with, I don't know if it was 30 or 40 million or 300 or 400 million. It's been so long, I can't remember, but I think it was more like 300 million. And then after that, the politics became a thing, started getting in the way big time. I mean, I remember we were close to having a deal with Honduras, and Honduras had become enamored with the idea of having their own Hong Kong, which is a great idea. You know, create a special economic zone where people could have more freedom to do things, and maybe they could create a success similar to Hong Kong that would then explode into the rest of their country, kind of the way that China revitalized its economy through adopting Hong Kong's norms. So the Hondurans actually adopted a law to allow for special economic zones, and then this was defeated in the Supreme Court. Oh, I don't know if you guys can hear the dog. And then it was defeated in the Supreme Court, and they changed their constitution to make it legal. And then the Seasteading Institute began talking to them behind the scenes and saying, "Hey, we're considering building a seastead in the coast of Honduras, and is that something you guys would be into?" And they said yes. And the talks got so advanced that the president of Honduras actually flew to San Francisco and was due to make a speech announcing all this with the Seasteading Institute. And when he arrived, a huge scandal broke out, and the speech was canceled and never actually ended up being happening. And then the elections happened, and he got kicked out of the office. And he probably was corrupt, like people say he was. You know, that's third world politics for you, if you ask me. A lot of it. But it was easily attacked by the opponents as you know, being like a form of colonialism. And after that, we pivoted and went to Tahiti, you know, French Polynesia, and I was very positive on that one. I traveled to the conference that they threw there, and you know, met with people, and we all had a great conference. Let's just put it that way. But again, when it came time to actually finalize things, we got a memorandum of understanding from the government, and they were, you know, this close again to actually having something solid, and then politics destroyed it. Another election happened. It was attacked as colonialism, and, you know, white people coming into a native land and taking native lands, stuff like that. And I think it's really easy to attack this sort of thing along those lines. But on the other hand, we felt like, you know, with this idea of paddling before we swim, we wanted to start seasteading in shallow water and have the coastal protection of an actual nation. That way we could avoid the charge that, you know, just going out into deep water would make you vulnerable to piracy or be some challenge to the UN or something like that. So we're navigating these problems created by politics and international boundaries and stuff like that. And there's a lot of questions about how to really address that, but my answer to that is simply, Well, let's do it off the coast of California, where we're not open to charges of colonialism or anything. And let's begin with structures that are houses and can't be accused of being anything other than a house. They function in shallow water. You guys may remember what happened in Thailand with Chad Elwartowski and the group down there that built these seasteads vertically with big pods on them, and the Navy basically shook them down and seized their seastead because I think it looks so radically different than a boat. And again, you had the colonialism charge happening. That just, I don't know, how do you guys deal with that?
Well, in my view, the colonialism allegations are rather absurd because nobody is coming in with guns, taking over a country, imposing any sorts of norms or laws or practices upon that country. It's all voluntary and consensual. And if you build a seastead off the coast of a country, that's not stopping the people who live there from leading the lives they choose. It's not stopping them from electing their own government officials. And furthermore, that could improve their standard of living by giving them more economic opportunities. Edward, what would you like to say?
Yeah, by the way, I have to sign off very soon here, but I would add this because Gennady and a couple of us are involved in working with Africans. I've, done international development work for many, many decades. And one of the things to remember is that the only people who really care about the colonialism charge are older people or radicals who are trying to shut up reformers. Most people in Nigeria never lived under a colonial government. They've lived under corrupt, crony, African despots, okay? So this is basically something that you're only going to hear from elites who are trying to, stop actual progress. And so throw it back in their faces. Whichever countries are putting up this charge, say, no, I'm in favor of helping the people in this country, not you fill in the blank of what expletive you want to use, bureaucrats and corrupt cronies. We're for freedom and liberty and opportunity, and we want to welcome everybody in the world, and that's what we are doing. As Gennady says, this is something that helps everybody, and more of that. That, remember, Africa has not had colonial rulers since like the 60s when most of them became free. So hit them with that, okay?
Unfortunately, Tahiti is still under colonial rule to this day.
Okay, well, that's unfortunate. And unfortunately, Hong Kong is not under colonial rule because I would certainly prefer it under the British than to under the current thugs. But anyway, I'll have to pop off in just a minute.
I think Jose had something for us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, well, very interesting points. And just another quotation, because the world is changing very fast. And also to talk about the first world and third world, that is from 40 years ago. The second world collapsed, almost 3-4 decades ago. So no one talks about first world and third world anymore. So I think it is also important in terms of terminology. But I do have a question about the future, because what you are talking about, Michael, is really fascinating. And you see a lot about this in science fiction literature, about world governments, competition about governments, competition about law, legal systems, and not just on planet Earth, but now that we are beginning the space exploration. And Elon Musk has announced that when he wants to create this city on Mars, it will have its own laws, its own government, its own legal system. So my question, all the wonderful things that you are doing in terms of seasteads, how do you visualize it soon? And I say soon, 1-2 decades into space steads as well.
That's a good question. Seasteads and space steads do have some of the same challenges. In both of them, you're cast adrift on an ocean. You have the problem of station keeping, which is a problem in space as well as on the water. It just becomes more 2D than 3D. We do talk about seasteading on the surface a lot, but seasteading under the water is also a factor, something that we could get into in the future, making taking advantage of 3D available space underneath the surface, and then you're very much similar to the way that you would be dealing with things in space, that is in 3 dimensions. In space, you have to, excuse me? Oh, thought I heard someone. In space, you have to keep air out, and under the water, you got to keep the water out. So you got to keep air in, rather. Ultimately, it creates a separation. It basically has to be self-governing because you're so far away. It's like when Elon Musk says that the Mars colony is going to have its own laws. Yeah, I can see that, because what are you going to do? Wait to communicate with Earth 15 minutes later and then wait 6 months for the police to arrive? I mean,
One quick thing before I leave, I've got to sign off in a
sure,
minute.
sure.
Some years ago, I met with Patrick Friedman to talk about this very issue, because I had done work on Martian law, because with my space work, I posted in this chat the link to it. I've done work since that time. And so there is definitely a correlation between how would law emerge on Mars, how would you have competing approaches, et cetera, and seasteading. And as I say, I actually met with him to talk about that. So maybe something to follow up with in the future. Okay? Yep. And I got to sign off. So great. I look forward to following up on this. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Edward. Take care.
Yes, indeed. And thank you, Edward, for joining us briefly and offering your thoughts. I just posted a link to Dr. Edward Hudgens's paper on Martian law from 1998, published by the Cato Institute. So our YouTube readers will have access to that. Also, in 2012, I published an essay on The Rational Argumentator, which is my online magazine, called Seasteading's Potential and Challenges, an Overview. And this was my outlook on the promises of seasteading, as well as some of the obstacles that it's likely to come across. And I'd like to read a brief excerpt from that, and we can discuss what you think of it, Michael. I wrote, "A major advantage of seasteading is that it can begin as a sufficiently low-profile movement to avoid crackdowns by existing centers of political power. The seasteading movement does not threaten the sovereignty of any country. It does not propose to take away any nation's territory or to challenge its government's jurisdiction over that territory. Indeed, the infant stages of seasteading may, out of practical necessity, entail the creation of seasteads that explicitly submit to the jurisdiction of the United States, Canada, or a country in Europe or East Asia. The purpose of these early seasteads would not be the direct exercise of political autonomy, but rather experimentation with seasteading technologies and modes of living. The early seasteads would yield useful insights about how to construct floating modular platforms to be durable, cost-efficient, spacious, and comfortable. At this stage, the seasteading movement does not require the support or even the notice of most people or even all liberty-oriented people. The people who are interested can advance the viability of seasteading by their direct work on improving seastead design and creating viable seastead-based businesses." And I read that because more than 8 years later, that seems to be what you're doing with Ventive Floathouse.
Yeah, I would say that the seasteading industry is very much in almost like a stealth mode right now, where we're not quite talking so much as trying to actually build and get the ball rolling. It used to be a concept, and now we're in the implementation phase. Even with what I'm building, I mean, we've identified all kinds of other things that you could do with just a floating structure like what we're building. One of the big ones I'm working on is floating breakwaters. We're going to need robust floating breakwaters for anything being done at the ocean. And I think I've cracked that nut, although I can't talk about it. not specifics, but I hope to have a demonstration for you guys soon. But everything from like fishing to research out there to mining the ocean floor. I mean, there's definitely a wealth of minerals underneath the ocean that we could tap into. There's oil, they're already out there drilling it, but there's all kinds of industries that might immediately and in the long term be able to get something from seasteading. One of the ones we like to talk about a lot is medical tourism and medical experimentation. Right now, if you're in the US, obviously you're under the FDA, you have all these problems getting drugs that are approved in other countries, but you can't get them here. And for some of those drugs, it's like, if it's a one-time dose, it's like, sure, maybe go to Italy and get treated. But a lot of the stuff that people need is a continuing dose throughout their lifetime, and they have no opportunity to actually get a hold of the stuff because they would have to move to some other country. But if we had a medical experimentation seastead outside international waters, these people could move there cheaply and live there and still be able to access the US by, by, like you said, taking a ferry, and have access to these life-saving treatments. And then with this is where we start tapping into transhumanism, because transhumanism is going to, in some ways, there are going to be experimental procedures that the FDA is going to want to say, no. If you want to prove that this extends life, or that you're actually uploading people to computers and stuff like that, then you're going to have to prove that to them. It's going to take 20, 30 years for some of those things. But let's say you're someone who wants to take advantage of a new treatment or some kind of transhumanist treatment that's experimental, but you're on your last legs. You only have a few months or years to live. You could go to a place like this and take your chances, rather than having someone say, no, you can't do that, even though you're willing.
Yes, and in the U.S. Transhumanist Party, we are strong advocates of the right to try, the right of patients to decide to pursue experimental medical treatments if they believe that those treatments will save them from a terrible disease or improve their health. And I do see a powerful possibility for seasteads to become venues for medical tourism that, as you mentioned, would be more convenient than going to another country. Hopefully, enough governments will take a hands-off attitude toward that and not see it as a direct threat, because it is outside of their jurisdiction and it doesn't expose their officials to direct risk, as the FDA officials are exposed today if they approve a particular treatment and there are adverse side effects. So I really like that potential business model. We have a question in our internal chat from Alexandria Black, who states, what we learn in developing seasteading should help us live on the water moons such as Europa. Do you agree in regard to space steading and this being a potential application of this knowledge?
Yes and no. I don't know if you guys have read the book, The High Frontier by Gerard O'Neill, but I'm taken with his take on space living, which he puts forth the idea that we're primarily going to live in space itself, in ocean space. And there's a number of great reasons for this, but the biggest of them is economic. When you're living in space, and I'm talking about what I call ocean space, you're not orbiting around any kind of astral body except for the sun. You're just out there, out of the gravity well of any other planet. And the amount of space that you have to build and to live is at that point enormous. And if we posit a future in which there are going to be not just billions, but trillions and even later quadrillions of human beings, that's the only realistic place that all those people could live. It's not on other planets. It's in space itself. And I think there will be a time when the vast majority of humanity is living in space and was born in space and has always lived up there. And this point in time when people all live on the planet will be viewed as something kind of historical. But as for Europa, could you live there? Let's say you wanted to live there to do seasteading on Europa. Well, it's extremely cold there. Maybe you probably could do it. You'd have to live under the ice. My favorite thing about Europa is that they have water volcanoes so powerful that they're literally shooting water into orbit around the planet. And for that reason, you could just swing by and harvest water off that place. But yeah, the tech that we're coming up with could, in theory, be used to live on Europa if that's what you wanted to do. But going back to Gerard O'Neill, to enter that gravity well would mean sacrificing the money and fuel that it costs you to get out of that gravity well. So you're talking about maybe tens of thousands of dollars it would cost you to enter that gravity well. And the same with Mars or going back into Earth. Once you're in deep space and able to live there, there's an economic cost to going back into a gravity well. And at the same time, there's economic advantages to being in space because your transport costs in space are effectively zero. You can just aim something and toss it, and it a million miles later, it ends up basically where you threw it for zero fuel costs, essentially. And the economies that they're going to be able to build out there are just going to be fantastic. It's going to be amazing. And the other big advantage of being in open space is you can tune gravity to what you want. We're not sure yet what it would mean to be born on Mars and grow up on Mars. And my intuition on that is that it would probably be a bad thing to be someone who grew up on Mars. It's very difficult to experience or to create a situation where you have more gravity on Mars. You would have to build these spinning structures at a strange angle, and you wouldn't be able to do it mass scale. Whereas in space, you can do it mass scale. You can spin an entire space station and get 1.0 gravity. On Mars with 1/3 gravity, I think anyone born on Mars and who grew up there would probably never be able to walk on Earth. You would just be in a wheelchair. Your bones and your muscles would never develop to that point. And it might even be lethal. We're not even sure. So if we find out that that's the case, then we might have centers on Mars. We might have visitor centers. We might have vacation spots, but we're not going to have cities there. And I'm okay with that because the idea of living in space, even though it's not right now what turns people on about space travel. Like, I think Elon Musk knows this too, but he's smart enough to know that the masses are just enamored by this idea of living on another planet. And so he's like, let's build all the tech to go live on Mars. Yeah. But in so doing, we're going to discover that living in space is the way to do it. And I think that's really smart of him.
Yes, indeed. And Jason Geringer in our YouTube chat says that you make a really good point about living in space itself and how it would be advantageous, especially if there are artificial gravity environments that can simulate the Earth's gravity. Now, we have a lot of questions in the YouTube chat already, and I will bring up one of them because I think this is a common concern that seasteaders face. Daniel Twett writes, if you are siphoning off existing offshore economic interests, there are bound to be tensions, just as brick and mortar restaurants don't appreciate food trucks parked out in front and undercutting them. So he asks, what about self-sufficient seasteads? Is there room for the seasteads to grow their own complementary economy and not be perceived as a threat by any of the existing economic interests in an area?
I actually think that having an organic economy out there would be one of the primary reasons why seasteads will be accepted by nation states and by people who live near them. Let's say I had an actual seastead running off of San Francisco, like I was talking about. Our ideal first businesses would all be tech and industry, tech and knowledge businesses, and things like knowledge workers who can build things on their computer and then they receive an income. It's not something where they need to actually import goods and export goods. But beyond the water is also great for that because the shipping cost of anything on the ocean is so dramatically smaller. It's like 2% the cost of shipping on land to ship by water. It's dramatically lower and cheaper to ship things on the ocean. And if you lived out there, to have access, basically if you live on the water, you have access to world markets, just for that one reason. And that's one of the big reasons why the USA, when it was young, was so great economically. It had the Mississippi River that if you look at where it extends, it goes through like 2/3 of the entire country. And if you lived anywhere in the US, it's like the USA literally had as many ports as the rest of the world at that point. It's just crazy. So if we're living on a seastead and we're trading with companies trade happens because both parties are obtaining something out of it, which means that that tends to create goodwill. It doesn't tend to create bad will. And if you can find that you're close trade partners with someone, then basically that person's going to be a friend to you and not see you as an enemy. And if we can then additionally generate jobs for locals, you know, you get to the point where you're having people who are like citizens of the nearby states traveling to work there and coming back, or actually living there and obtaining income that way, then that should be positive for everyone. I don't know, what do you guys think about that?
Yes, I definitely think from a rational standpoint, there will be net benefits and people ought to appreciate them. It's very short-sighted people and institutions that tend to engage in this protectionist type of thinking, trying to restrict any changes to economic arrangements. But I'm open to other comments from the panel about this, and more generally, what people think are some of the challenges that seasteading would need to overcome. Go ahead, David.
Yeah, thanks. Fascinating topic. Had a couple of thoughts. I've been writing some questions down as we've been going on, but the one that I'll start with has to do with whether it's in space or whether it's on the sea. Let's start with the sea. I look at energy production. So, you know, solar in certain aspects of the sea could be valuable. I also fantasize, I suppose, about maybe wave, water motion, production of energy, and perhaps even undersea currents and so forth. But I'm wondering what you've looked at, thinking that you have some practical ideas here for, say, starting this seastead off the coast of California.
I actually think that the energy issue is one of the biggest reasons why seasteading never took off previously. Before maybe 10 or 15 years ago, to do a seastead in deep water, you would have had to ferry diesel fuel back and forth. You would have been tied to land very strongly because of the energy issue. Now with robust solar cells, we're in a good position. We can do floating solar farms, which is my preference. And there's actually an advantage to doing so because solar cells become less efficient and generate less energy the hotter they get. And by having a floating solar farm next to the water keeps them cool, and you're able to get another 20 or 30% efficiency out of them and energy production. So I would tend to go solar. In fact, the plans that we've had for building seasteads have floating solar farms. But I have obviously over the years considered a lot of other ideas that we could talk about for sure. One of them is OTEC, Ocean Thermal Energy Conversion. I don't know if you've heard of that. That's where you take cold water from 1,000 feet down or 1,000 meters down, and you pump it up to the surface, and you mix it with the warm water up here, and you create a heat engine that's able to heat exchange between them, which generates energy. And one of the byproducts is actually fresh water. So you've got a lot of cool things coming out of that. And it's basically there's no emissions or anything, but we don't know what it would do to the environment, especially the deep water environment. Now, there are suggestions that the deep water is very nutritious, which we would be bringing to the surface, which would be positive for fish. And you're bringing down hot water. Not sure what that would do, but the ocean is so vast, it probably wouldn't make much difference, especially if you were in very, very deep water and you're just pulling from 1,000 meters down and you're not even near the seafloor. That would be one thing, but there are suggestions it could disrupt things like underwater currents, which rely on different temperatures. So if you had 1 million of these in the Pacific Ocean, that might be a problem. Let's put it that way. And then the same thing with putting turbines in the currents. The currents in the ocean are awesome and massive and just gobs of energy. And yeah, you could put some big turbines in them. There's concerns about what if the turbines are hurting the fish or the whales swim into it, but these tend to spin very, very slowly. Actually, the bigger they are, the slower they spin, and they still generate significant energy. They're not like a wind turbine that goes very, very fast. But to do that, you have to anchor to the seafloor essentially, and that's less of a good thing. And it's going to be positional because you're not always going to be in the ideal area for that kind of thing. And now you're binding yourself to one specific area, whereas a seastead could float around and move around as it desires. There are these things called ocean gyres, which are giant tendencies of like whirlpools. And the ocean naturally has these gyres that just move very slowly over the years in about a 2-year cycle. So every 2 years on the Pacific coast, you have a gyre that comes down out of the north, and then it'll be replaced by another one. So what you could do to semi-permanently place a seastead is just move a seastead into the middle of the gyre, which it would be kept there. And then every 2 years, you just float it back up to the next gyre. And so you're always pretty close to where you should be, but you're not always in one place. So that would be a problem if you were doing that kind of seastead and you had a ocean current turbine. What else could we do with power? Those are the big three that I think we could do. Wind. We could do wind power. Floating wind power is a big one. That's very big in Europe. And that's viable today, whereas OTEC is still fairly theoretical. One of the big reasons we're not doing OTEC immediately is because it's considered to not be economical until you need about 5 megawatts. So 5 megawatts, that's maybe 10,000 people, I'm not sure. But it's something you have to build up to. But I think at the end of the day, solar is going to do it. You could do wave energy, but that, again, is perspective. The floating breakwater concept I'm working on currently might be able to do some wave energy aspects to it, but that's going to be secondary to proving that it actually prevents the waves from destroying seasteads. It's like if it works this way, it'll do so by opposing the motion of the wave, which causes it to rise, which could then be used to turn a turbine as it falls. But let's deal with the first thing first. And would that produce significant or enough power? I don't know. But yeah, it's definitely good to explore. The other one I like to think about is compressed air. So when you have the water going up and down, you can use the ocean water itself as an incompressible cylinder, and that can generate significant compressed air. I'm only about 2 blocks from the ocean here, and there is a buoy not too far. Maybe it's a couple miles away, okay? But it's a buoy that actually uses compressed air from the waves, and it doesn't take much wave energy. It maybe like this much wave difference causes this thing to compress and has a foghorn at the top that you can hear miles away. It's pretty amazing, but there is significant compressed air opportunities, and compressed air has a similar density as gasoline. So yeah, there's opportunities, but what can I buy off the shelf today? It's going to be solar.
Yes, thank you for that thorough overview of the possible methods of energy generation for seasteads. Now we have a question from Liz Parrish. Liz, go ahead.
Hi, I hope you can hear me. Thank you for all of your work in this area. I became pretty interested in seasteading in about 2014, and by 2015, I had exhausted what appeared to be our options for medical tourism. Right here in the Pacific Northwest, we have a lot of really fantastic old NOAA ships that have been decommissioned and could be retrofitted to become medical tourism and actually help a lot of people. But the problem that we ran into was licensing. And so it wasn't just where the boat was licensed, it was the license of the person driving it. We went through maritime attorneys and tried to sort out, how we could proficiently move this boat out, how long it could stay out, where it would have to come back into, which is a problem, and who's driving it. I mean, it literally was. Now, I know that attorneys vastly are there to say no, but it became very prohibitive. And so, for instance, where you're building these structures, whether it's off the coast of San Francisco or Tahiti or anything else, doesn't to me seem to matter as long as they're stable outside into international waters. But how are you dealing with the licensing of these boats? Because that dictates anytime they enter national waters, what happens, where they came from, and who's driving them.
It's a very good question, and one I haven't spent too much time looking into, but I will give you where my head's at currently. the well, the biggest issue is it your boat, or are you ferrying customers? In other words, are you doing something commercially, or is this your structure? So what I want to do is actually an end run. If you want to live in a seastead long term, you buy your own structure and you simply move out there. It's much easier for you to own and pilot and move your own structure than to get a license and insurance to do something that's going to have customers who are paying you to do that thing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
But then you have the problem of getting people to the location. So some of these ships have the ability to land a helicopter on them, but getting to a helicopter and getting out to the boat seem to be as prohibitive as some other travel means that people need. For instance, just this last year, we took a trip into international waters to check things out. It was quite rough. People were sick. And this was, just a joyride to see how in fact would this work.
I understand. That's an issue, but it's an issue of scale mainly, I think. If you're doing small scale, then you can't really afford to have really comfortable boats taking you out in international waters. If you're doing it medium scale, you can afford larger boats that are nicer to ride on. And if you're doing it in a massive scale, you can literally have a floating airport out there that people are just flying into. Or you could have hovercraft that simply aren't affected by waves. Or you could even look at ground effect craft that are. It's really nice to fly a ground effect craft right over the water, maybe like 20 feet off the water. It's fuel efficient and fast, and there's no issue with waves making anyone sick.
Yeah, I like the catamaran style. Also, I'm not sure what happened to the super ferries in Hawaii. They had built a whole fleet of really awesome super ferry catamaran style boats that could carry cars and everything. But then, the local people didn't want them there. The first trip through ended up bringing some dirt from one island to another, and that was the end of that. I'm not sure what happened to those boats.
In the 90s, I visited France from Britain to France, and they had these awesome, gigantic hoverboats that would take 300, 400 people at a time. And they got rid of those when the channel went through, but just what a thrilling craft to be on. These massive hoverboats.
You got to think that these things are out there and they would be accessible to actually help ferry people to and from. But still, we come down to the legalities and the issues of where a boat is made or a structure is made, does that affect the licensure of it going into international waters? And then some of the bigger effects of lesser laws are obviously a really good idea, but then there still has to be some, or else you're really like looking at a civil revolution out there on a craft.
Let me just say one more thing before I address that. It might be possible to simply use a float house as a ferry and bring people out en masse in a train of float houses. You could connect them end to end. That's a possibility. And it would just take longer to get there, but that's okay, as long as you're comfortable. And to address your second question, where does where you're building it affect it? Yes. One of the interesting things about the U.S. government is they claim jurisdiction over any boat that has ever docked in the U.S. As ridiculous as that sounds. So if you've built it in the U.S. or you've ever docked in a U.S. port, they feel free to board you at any time. And practically, they probably feel free to board anyone at any time, anywhere, anyway. So, but what I actually want to do is begin building float houses on the water so that claim can be made, among other things. I'm not sure if that affects how you have to license it as to where you can build it, but at this point, I could build these basically anywhere. I've got currently open invitation to build them in Panama if I wanted to. So if that became a barrier, then yes, that would be my responsibility elsewhere.
What would be the ownership in international waters? For instance, if you buy a house, depending on the state in the United States, you might own, 2 feet into the soil and, 20 feet into the sky above it. Has there been any sort of ideals of, what ownership would look like? I imagine you would just own the structure. What does that look like for seasteading?
That's a good question, especially as we talk about the idea of decentralized law and how we would do non-state cities out there. My current solution is that if we're going to build a non-state city, we're going to build it on formal, what you might call formal gentlemen's agreements, which would be private contracts that don't have legal force in any state, but have legal force within that community between each other. And while international law makes it illegal to actually claim a body of water right now, that doesn't mean that we can't act within ourselves as if a body of water has been claimed. And then when the authorities come around and say, no, we haven't claimed any water, we're just acting, we're giving each other grace, basically. And we can formalize those agreements within a private city without actually breaking international law. And most of the things you're going to do out there won't require you to own any body of water or anything like that. You're just literally, like you said, you're going to own the structure. And that's one of the biggest resolutions, is that anything you build, you're going to own. So there's really not many questions like, well, how much vertically and below do we own? So no, you just own the structure and the water goes underneath you. But if you were doing certain kinds of commercial things that required a set place on the seafloor or fencing off fish pens or something like that, you might create de facto ownership of that fish pen by fencing it off and flagging it off and saying, hey, this is a structure that we need to be respected. You don't want boats cutting your lines and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, that's what the formal agreements would be used for. But if we actually had a seastead city and we began doing that, which we would have to in order to have a city of any scale, then what inevitably happens is that over time and through custom and use, what is de facto and informal becomes permanent and formal. So let's say you actually had a seasteading city that was up and running for 50 years. By the end of that, essentially you have ownership. And no one's going to say, well, you don't.
And then you need to make sure that you have some sort of right in for infrastructure. For instance, like Alaska, you don't own any of your land, right? Because there might be oil under it. So the government has the ability to go in and take anything right under you they need. But on the flip side of that, so let's look at benefits, the power system, the power grid in the United States, if you're on it, great job if you're not. But if you're on it, they do need to have the right to attach to your house and upgrade your electrical and wiring and things like that. So probably even building in some sort of standard for, we may, need the space underneath your structure in order to provide you with the quality of living that, our encapsulated space or island or nation actually exists by, which would be energy and other things. Thank you anyway so much for being here. It was really fantastic to listen in. Sorry, don't want to take any more time.
I would like to add also on top of that, that I'm not talking about ownership within the EEZ, the exclusive economic zone, which comes out 200 miles from every shoreline. We're not talking about de facto owning that or trying to claim ownership of that over time. We're talking about being outside of that in extremely deep water where literally no one has a claim. And people, in my experience, don't generally understand quite how big the Pacific Ocean is. And I recently came across my favorite way to explain it. The Pacific Ocean at its widest is so big that you could fit 5 of our moons across it. That's how big it is. It is massive. It literally covers 1/3 of the surface of the planet just by itself. So yeah, we could literally
quite striking.
we could literally fit everyone on the planet on there. We could put billions of people, maybe even tens of billions. And most of that water is dead water. It's a desert in terms of ocean life. All the ocean life is concentrated near the shores in the EEZs, most of it. And there's a lot of opportunities for ways that we could actually revitalize the ocean and create fish habitats out there that don't currently exist, and thus add to the ocean rather than subtract from it by our presence.
Yes, indeed. And Alexandria Black in our chat pointed out that David Shoemaker's background picture makes the point. Look at all this space on the water that can be seen. Indeed, for many years now, I've encountered statements to the effect that if we take all of human civilization today, all of the developed areas, and put them adjacent to one another just as a thought experiment, they would fit within the land area of the state of Texas. So there's plenty, both on land and on the sea, for expansion. We're not going to run out of space for billions upon billions more human beings. Now, Alexandria also has another question. While we still have the discussion of energy fresh in our minds, she asks, how will new developments in battery technologies help open up various ways to harvest energy? What do you think about battery technology in the context of seasteading?
That's interesting. There are actually some unique battery technologies that the ocean offers that I don't think most people are aware of. And a lot of these have to do with potential energy. So if I'll give you one you're probably more familiar with, which is some places in the world, I think Switzerland does this. I'm not sure. I know Tahiti does this. They will pump water up a mountain into reservoirs. And then when you want to reclaim that water, you just run it down through a turbine. Okay. So you don't have any mountains on the ocean, but what you do have is flotation. So something you can do as a form of battery in the ocean is to literally have a line that goes all the way to the seafloor on a pulley, and then have a float coming off the pulley. So the float is always pulling up. And when you want to add energy, you pull the float down into the water. And later, when you want to recover that energy, you take the brake off and the float pulls down on that line as strongly as you pulled it up. And so by that means you can store potential energy. Another option that has less moving parts is you simply have a giant container full of water on the seafloor or just in the ocean, and you pump out water. And when you pump out water, water naturally wants to go back into there. So now you're talking about using compressed air. There's a couple schemes like that that could be used to generate energy and to store it in the ocean that are unique to the ocean power. But apart from that, new developments in battery technology, are you referring to any specific developments like getting away from lithium ion and into things like carbon-based batteries?
We will wait for Alexandria to clarify that. Feel free to do that, Alexandria, either in the chat or if you would like to speak. Now, in the meantime, David has an observation with regard to oil company drilling platforms, which sometimes are reminiscent of small cities. He's asking, do you know of any in deep water, and are there any lessons learned from that?
Yeah, there are definitely drilling being done in deep water, very deep water in some cases. One of the things we have investigated was using the float house as a kind of more comfortable living space for people living on oil platforms, and making it / an escape pod. Oil platforms are not designed to be comfortable to live on. They're pretty uncomfortable, as I understand. Never been on one, but I understand that they rock all over the place and they're pretty bad. And we've seen some famous disasters happen, and a lot of lives were lost. So if you can minimize your potential insurance risk by moving people off into more comfortable living space while they're off duty. So we've thought about pitching that to oil platforms. We want to actually build a demonstrator before we pitch that to them, but we think that could be interesting. But we also have to, at that point, show that they're going to be either very stable in rough water, or that we could put a floating breakwater there and tame the waves in that place. Now, if you go on my website, there's one version that's vertical, the spar type floathouse, and that structure should be pretty comfortable and weatherproof on its own without needing a floating breakwater. So maybe that would be the kind of one that we would pitch for that. The other great thing about the oil companies is they've pioneered how to do deep water anchoring and station keeping. And so a lot of the technology is already in place to anchor as large of a seastead as you could possibly want. One of the things we're looking at is seamounts. Now, seamount is a mountain under the water that doesn't quite come to the surface. They average about 2,000 feet under the water is where they come up to. And some of them have a large flat area under that water, and then they go down from there. And in the Pacific Ocean, you can go on Google Earth and actually see all the mapped seamounts there are. There's literally hundreds of them. And a lot of them are close to the California shore. A lot of them go up north, and a lot of them go towards Asia, but they're literally all over the place, all the way down to Southeast Asia. And those would be natural spots to investigate, especially outside the EZ, as an early seastead location. And we would just use that technology that the oil companies have developed already for how to anchor. And at that point, it's just an application of resources.
Yes, thank you for addressing that. Now, Alexandria, do you have any follow-ups on your battery question? Let's give her a few moments in.
Oh, I wrote it in chat. I don't remember the details about that new battery tech. I was hoping someone else had picked up on that.
Is it the one made out of glass?
Maybe the board can help me out here, because I just scanned by it and didn't pick up on it. But I was also making a comment that I lived through a few North Sea gales. Mm-hmm. That can be rather digestively hazardous. So I don't want to live through that again. But as long as you keep me reasonably, in one place, I'm fine.
Well, that's one of the reasons why my structure doesn't have a roof on it. It's round. It's designed to not catch the wind. And I like the idea of having of seasteading having its own characteristic architecture. Like, instead of being these 90-degree boxes with roofs that we all live in, we start looking at things in terms of smooth curves and hexagons, which are very ocean friendly, triangles. The Bermuda-based structure on my website, which is the 3 float houses together in a triangle shape, should be pretty difficult for any waves to do much about it, even by itself. I mean, it would still move around in wave action for sure, but we could put water parachutes on the bottom that would tend to anchor it so it couldn't rise rapidly. And the whole structure together with 3 of them like that would weigh almost 1 million pounds. And so between the 2 of those things, you're talking about, people are used to what it feels like to be on a sailboat and how that performs and how that moves around. But sailboats are what are called super stable. Like, the second they tip, they want to immediately come back to center. So it's like the smallest wave is throwing them all around, and they're very top heavy. But the structure that I'm building is very, very heavy in the water, 10 times heavier than a sailboat of the same size. And with the round hull is not super stable. They tend to do what's called long period rolling, rather than a sailboat that does short period rolling. And long period rolling is considered very comfortable and would not tend to make you seasick. And that's just one of them by itself. You put the 3 together like that, and then you factor in floating breakwaters, and I think we could have structures that you almost never feel any kind of motion out of it at all, even in a North Sea gale.
Yes, hopefully some of these issues with people feeling seasick will be addressed by seasteading technology. Now, there are various natural disaster risks that, of course, arise on the oceans, earthquakes and the accompanying tsunamis are an example. Other examples have been brought up in the YouTube chat. For instance, Mike Lezine asks, what would one do to prevent typhoons from destroying a sea-based nation? And on the other hand, Jason Geringer asks, could it be possible perhaps to have a seastead that is also a tsunami defense, like a seawall of some sort? Well, what do you think about, one, how can seasteads be resilient against these disasters? And two, could they provide some additional defensive capability?
That's interesting. That's interesting. You have a couple options. I mean, I'm starting by focusing on a territory that doesn't have any kind of storm issues, that being Southern California. It's been a long time since the last hurricane around here, I understand. But you do have advanced warning on a lot of hurricanes, although moving a seastead is pretty slow. So you would definitely want to build a seastead that could survive a direct hit from a hurricane. And again, that's what I was talking about with the curved shape of my structure is designed to survive hurricanes. And the technology that I'm taking inspiration from is a company called Monolithic Dome that operates here in the US. And they build concrete structures that are extremely hardy and have survived even a direct hit by tornadoes, much less a hurricane. They survive hurricanes without any kind of problem at all. So that's not too much of a worry for me. And then you have the issue of tsunami you're talking about. Well, tsunamis are not a threat to a seastead at all. They actually don't threaten a seastead or a boat at all. It's only when you get near shore that they become an issue. It's the fact that you have a tsunami being like this unforgiving force that comes up against the shore that just does not move. That's what creates all the damage of a tsunami. So if you had a seastead 200 miles out or even 14 miles out, a tsunami is going to go directly under it. You might not even notice it happened. That far out, it doesn't even manifest as anything except for energy travel. And then we're talking about, could we create tsunami defenses? Well, yeah, actually. If you look down at what Venice is doing currently, they have a system of deployable floating breakwaters that they can bring out, and they're using it for tide control, but there's not a huge difference between a tide and a tsunami. So if you had a region that was important enough to protect and hit by tsunamis enough that you wanted to put in place some kind of tsunami defense, that could definitely be built. I could see that happening. Maybe you want to build something that's kind of like an artificial beach, where it's like a structure that tilts in the water like this, where the tsunami hits it and thinks it's his land, and then it rides up and expends all its energy going vertically and then just kind of sloshes back down. Or maybe you make, by some means like that, you make it expel its energy. That could be done for sure. I could see that happening.
Yes, and that would be a great innovation for tsunami prevention because, of course, the Japanese coast, for example, is highly vulnerable to tsunamis, but it's not inconceivable if there were a massive earthquake off the shore of the Pacific Ocean for a tsunami to be there as well.
Now, hurricane protection, that's another matter entirely. I have read something about they thought that they could do something where if they put a layer of oil over the water on a wide scale enough basis that could potentially cause hurricanes to burn off. Something about the interchange of heat, doing something about that. But no one's, like, it would be such a massive undertaking. I mean, hurricanes are so huge, and how would you do it? And what would the environmental costs be? And what happens to the oil afterwards? Yada, yada. No one's even tried it yet.
But I'm glad at least that there has been some conceptual thinking along these lines. I do think transhumanists are going to need to address the challenge of natural disaster prevention, particularly if and when we're successful in our goal of attaining significantly longer lifespans. It will become more probable for any given individual to face a natural disaster personally. So I think people will care more about this.
Some of the safest places in the world are actually at the bottom of the seafloors and just underneath the surface. Like, you don't hear about whales being threatened by a rainstorm. It's like, a rainstorm with huge waves could topple and destroy many of our biggest warships. But whales, being just underneath the surface, they just ride it out and they just go a little bit deeper. Most wave action is in the first 30 feet of the water column. And once you get below that, there's actually not much motion at all. So if you wanted to create an underwater city that started, 30 feet and down, that conceivably could be a far safer environment than just about anywhere else on Earth, even on land. Maybe about as safe as Vegas. Like lots of places use Vegas as a safe harbor for data centers and stuff like that, because it doesn't have any natural disasters. It's not going to get hit by a hurricane, anything like that. But that's one place in the world. It's pretty hard to get there too. But you could build that literally anywhere, off the coast of anywhere, and you'd have effectively the same amount of security, except that the tech is not there yet. Google recently pulled up a underwater server farm that they had down there. I think they left it down there for 3 years or something. And it was a successful test. The thing didn't leak and it worked, and it wasn't destroyed or anything. But that's the future we're moving towards, one where not only is the ocean available, but space will be available, and even under the ocean will be available. And I think that's going to open up a lot of opportunities, not just in business, but for achieving things that most people have no idea is possible at this point, and that includes transhumanism.
Yes, indeed. And of course, the U.S. Transhumanist Party fully supports human expansion, both on top of the ocean surfaces and underneath. So we support the construction of underwater habitats and habitats in space, anything that expands the bounds of human habitation and increases our potential for human endeavors that transform the world, transform our opportunities for the better, is highly welcomed. And I would say it's interesting to consider the choice of location that people will have and how they will need to weigh the risks of certain perils in some environments versus the benefits of the absence of other perils. Clearly, you're not going to have a wildfire on the ocean floor, for example. But we did have a question about cryonics from the international transhumanist movement. And the question is, what do you think of the idea of using seasteading platforms for safe cryonic storages? The ocean can be a rough place sometimes. Do you think it would be a reliable place for some cryopreserved patients to be stored, or do you think that's a better use for underwater cities or underwater habitats?
Yeah, I was actually just thinking about that with my last comment, and for sure you would want to do it underwater, and you would probably want to bore into the seafloor or into rock and build a facility that way. The biggest thing about cryonic preservation is temperature stability. It's not so much what temp you're keeping things at, but you really don't want that temps to change. And the great thing about being underwater is you have a relatively secure temperature buffer, that being the ocean all around you. And if you go deep enough, you're already in a pretty cold range anyway. So you would want to balance how deep you're going versus how much temperature stability you want. And because it's difficult for the human to live at a certain depth, but at the same time, you're going to get more temperature stability at a certain depth. So, I mean, we're talking about something that's probably 50 years out before anyone would even try to build a structure like that. But it's interesting. I listened to an Isaac Arthur podcast about cryonics recently, and he was talking about the possibility of people having brain implants and augmenting your brain with computers and replacement neurons. And he said something that was really interesting that I'd never heard before. I thought that was awesome, which is, if you had a human being augmented with a bionic brain, and enough of that brain was machine that it could operate at cryonic temperatures. You could realistically have people in cryonic storage who were still conscious.
Yes, that is quite an interesting concept. You know, it had never occurred to me until you mentioned it, but that could be a way of preserving the continuity of the self. We had a lot of virtual enlightenment salons on cryonics where this was a subject of discussion, and cryonics, of course, places one's biological systems in as close to stasis as is possible, given contemporary technologies. And so my concern was, does that interrupt the I-ness, which is a function, of course, of physical processes, currently biological physical processes. But if you have time to develop some artificial augmentation of your brain, and I do think that would need to be a gradual process as well. So neuron by neuron, this artificial component gets integrated into your brain, starts bearing some of the cognitive load. If you have to be cryopreserved, by the time you're cryopreserved, that artificial part of the brain can still keep running, and maybe it could be connected to the internet and send messages, post to the future equivalent of social media and say, I'm still here, feed me data about what's happening in the world, so that when I'm revived, I'm not so astonished about the changes that have transpired. So that is a neat idea. Thank you for bringing that up.
I did a course on the philosophy of mind once, and I agree with what you alluded to there about the way to do it would be, successive neuron replacement, and that continuity of consciousness would keep that as you. But that's such a great thought that once that process was complete, you now have a computer that works better at cryonic temperatures than it does at room temperatures. You're down there, you're in cryonics, and you're conscious, and it's not even about, oh, feed me information until I come back. Why not do simulated worlds? Now you have entire populations who are in cryonics, but they're living in a simulated world. It might as well be as real as the world we're in now. It could be far more expensive even. And I think this is actually one potential solution to the Fermi's paradox. Where do the aliens go? Oh, they're just simulating themselves in some cryonic reality. There's no reason to, if you can't ever go faster than light speed, which is probable, then there's no reason to go traipsing across the universe when you can just simulate a far better reality right here.
This is quite interesting. Now, I do hope that humans will continue to expand, and that ours will be the civilization that builds ever outward, because I do see value in transforming the external world, not just having personal experiences in one's mind, however enjoyable, given that there are external prerequisites to one's existence. And even if you have people in cryonic suspension, there will need to be a whole advanced infrastructure of civilization to support them. Alexandria Black jokes in our internal chat that perhaps sleeping with the fishes just got a new context, or wakefulness with the fishes. I don't know to what extent such a cryonics patient might have a connection to a camera and could see the fish outside of the cryonics facility. But it's an interesting thought. Now, we do have a question about a recent event that transpired in off the coast of Thailand in 2019, and I have now posted a link to an article about this by Brian Doherty of Reason Magazine. It's titled "How Two Seasteaders Wound Up Marked for Death," and Zach Richardson writes about this. He asks, can you give us your thoughts on Chad and Nadia, please? That's really the elephant in the room. Chad and Nadia were two Bitcoin millionaires who spent their funds building a seastead near Thailand. As soon as they finished, the Thai Navy came in and seized the structure and arrested them, claiming it was a, quote, threat to national security. And of course, the allegation sounds absurd on its face, but do you have any insights as to what happened there, and what does that portend for the future of seasteading?
Well, first of all, as far as I'm concerned, Chad and Nadia are heroes and have done something amazing, and are being, well, they tried to turn them into martyrs, but they escaped from their authority. But I love what they've done there, and I love their company and all that. I'm sorry, I'm blanking on their company name right now, but what they built was awesome, and I know some of the inside story on that, and if I recall, and I'm pretty sure they're okay with me sharing this, is that they had been reassured multiple times that they would be able to do anything they wanted out there, and the government wouldn't care. And of course, that's not quite what happened. And my assessment would be one, that it became political, of course, and it's also probable that the whole Bitcoin word being thrown around, it's some have speculated that maybe the guy running the Thai Navy wanted to shake them down a little bit. That's not too unusual in that part of the world. And the other thing is that one of the lessons we learned is they were just 14 miles out, whereas the Navy claimed that they were in territorial waters. So our takeaway from that was, okay, let's never be in a place that they can make that kind of plausible claim again. Like if we're going to be in international waters, let's be 20, 30, 50 miles out, when we get there. And the other thing is that their structure is so different from a boat that it kind of, I think it made itself a target, because there's a natural pushback in society against things that are different and new until they're proven. And I think my structure gets around that because it just barely passes as a boat-like structure. And that's how we're rolling it out initially, is as a boat, and it doesn't need to be in 60 feet of water. My structure is actually fine with shallow water, so you can keep it inland, whereas his could not be kept inland. It's like no one could see it unless you actually went out there. And they had really good relationships with the fishermen out there. They'd stop by and sell them fish or buy food from them, stuff like that. But I think it's kind of tragic what happened, and I think the Thai Navy overreached for sure. And I'm glad they got the heck out of there, and I'm glad that they are coming back with round 2 in Panama, where they're currently building. And I understand they've sold out their first year of production, and I just love what they're doing. The fact that there's not just me doing this, but other people see the value in doing this too, is a boon to me. And I would like to, once I actually build one of these things and we start production, I want to start putting a couple down in Panama where they are now, get a little community out there going. I've been pitched places all over the world. It's got to start somewhere.
Yes, that's excellent to hear that they are continuing to pursue seasteading despite what was obviously a traumatic experience. And I wish them all the best off the coast of Panama. Hopefully they won't run into the same issue. What is astonishing also is it cost the Thai Navy about $1 million in order to haul their tiny seastead back to shore. That's a huge expenditure of money. There are so many opportunity costs involved in that. And that just speaks to human irrationality sometimes, how people can be so afraid of an innovation that they're going to spend outsized amounts to try to suppress it.
Well, the state does one thing well, and that's use force. And I think when they encounter any new problem, their natural inclination is to use force. And that's why one of the best things that we can do is invest in things that are, digital and virtual, that simply do not respond to force. Like, the government hates cryptography. Why? Because no matter how many hammers or guns you have, you can't crack cryptography. And coming at it as I do from the perspective of saying, okay, if we're going to do seasteading, let's do it on an individual basis with people who own their own stuff. I just want to sell living space to people, and if they at some point want to move to a seastead with it, they'll have that option. But then if someone comes along and break it up, okay, they can just all sail to some other part of the world. Hopefully that will work in a way that past attempts haven't. We'll see.
Yes, indeed. I hope so as well. And I think the kinds of structures you're developing are indeed unobtrusive enough to hopefully not attract that kind of negative attention and pass as unusual looking boats in the minds of a lot of officials.
And at least for a few years, I'm going to be selling them as living space in marinas. It should become something that enters the consciousness as, oh, this is a boat in a living space for private individuals. Even if I said, I'm saying publicly now, I intend to make seasteads, but the vast majority of people who see these are not going to think, oh, at some point there's going to be cities on the sea based on these, Part of it is the woo-woo factor. You say, well, what the Thai Navy did was they came out and they accused Chad and Nadia of being like revolutionaries who wanted to overthrow the Thai government. It was all this stuff. They threw out this rhetoric that was designed to paint them in the worst possible light, simply because Chad's a libertarian and at one point said, not that he wanted to overthrow anyone's government, but just that he's not in favor of having a state on the ocean. Simple, regular libertarian stuff that's not a threat to any government necessarily, but that's how they took it. And they're always going to do that kind of thing. So we just have to be a little bit smarter than that.
Yes, I would be interested to see what the Thai government thinks the realistic possibility of launching a revolution from such a seastead that was stationary as far as it seems from the pictures. I mean, how could they even invade Thailand with that tiny thing?
Yeah, I would love to at one point see maybe like sell floathouses to people in Thailand and have them just use them down there, or even to have Chad and Nadia if they ended up selling to Thai customers, because that's got to be a lot of like free publicity down there, right? So it would be a great thing if in the future Thailand was instrumental in creating seasteading, kind of like a /dotted it type of thing, or what's that term? Never mind. It's like /dotting it, or like giving it free publicity, basically.
Yes, well, hopefully the political environment there will change sufficiently to make that happen. Now, Alexandria Black is curious, is it possible that some other nation pressured Thailand to shut down that seastead? Do you think that's a realistic scenario of what might have happened?
That's the question, isn't it? Back in the 70s, there was, oh God, I'm blanking on the name, but back in the 70s, there was a group who bought a ship, a group of libertarians in the US who bought a ship and went out to Tonga. And they claimed a sandbar off of Tonga, maybe like 50 miles out. Excuse me. And the Tonga government, I believe, was pressured by the USA to go assert authority there. So the Tongan Marines showed up and got rid of the Americans. But I think there is an organized effort to not have any kind of stateless society established. So I think it's quite plausible that some other nation pressured Thailand. I think it's plausible, but if they had their own citizens doing it rather than any kind of American citizens involved, they wouldn't be able to pass that same rhetoric. And if they had it only as if we're not talking about making cities, but it's just single family housing, then it's just another form of housing. It should be able to gain acceptance on that basis before we're talking about making cities, and then it would be much harder to lie about what it actually is. That's my thought on it. Shoot, there was something I wanted to bring up, but I forgot it, so I'm going to just pass along.
All right. Well, if you remember it, feel free to mention it. Now, we have another question.
I remembered.
Okay, go ahead.
Let me throw this back in there real quick. I think that seasteading is actually potentially revolutionary. I think that if we can demonstrate new ways to organize society that produce desirable results for people, that this could become models for other nations to adopt in the future. And I think there's precedent for that, because that seems to me how democracy ended up replacing monarchy. You had one place in the world, the USA, that demonstrated that democracy could be stable. At that time in Europe, everyone was saying democracy would never work, that there was no reason for any president to ever give up power peacefully. They thought it would lead to civil war every 4 years. But as the US began operating and that didn't happen, they realized that it was stable, and out of their own free will, just about everywhere in the world has now adopted it on their own, with struggle and without. But I think seasteading offers a similar opportunity because it's a place where there is nothing, there's no state, and new systems of governance and organizing society can therefore be prototyped without threatening anyone. And that if we can get that going, not only can we solve a lot of world problems happening right now, but this could be a model for how to reform our institutions that today are essentially handed down from a time of barbarism. And the state and the law that we put together originally to help us and to help society is instead making us the tool of its own ends. And I think a lot of the strife that we're beginning to see, not just in the US, but elsewhere, is due to that, the growing power of the state is beginning to make society serve its own ends instead of being something that serves the ends of society. And that points towards a conflict that's going to have to be resolved at some point. And I think it can be peacefully resolved if we can demonstrate new ways to build societies without that flaw.
Yes, and the jurisdictional experimentation that seasteading offers could indeed be revolutionary throughout the world, in that if a good idea is originated on a seastead somewhere, then the governments of existing countries on land could readily adapt it, and there would be a lot of impetus for reform in existing jurisdictions. And I do see perhaps a concern that some existing power elites may think that allowing seasteading to occur anywhere is dangerous precisely for that reason, that it will essentially be a catalyst for significant reforms that they would rather avoid.
Well, on the other hand, they could view us as a solution to their short-term political problems. For instance, that's how the U.S. was viewed by Britain, right? Where the USA was a place that you sent your problem children. It was a place, the colonies were a place that you sent the criminals and the people who stole from you and that kind of thing. And then when the U.S. shut that down, they started doing the same with Australia. Australia began solving that problem for them. So in a way, let's say that the government in the US at least views libertarians as a problem. If we come in and say, hey, we're going to drain off all the libertarians, you guys will be left alone. They might view that as a positive politically for them, at least in the short term, without necessarily thinking, because politicians are short-term thinkers anyways by incentive, that without having to worry about what's going to happen 50 or 100 years down the road, because they're already out of office by then, so they don't care.
Yes, I hope that that kind of short-term thinking can be used to create an environment of de facto benign neglect, as happened with the American colonies.
And I do like to say that we're going to need a little bit of historical luck, I think. We might need, I don't want to say a crisis, but something that it takes the attention of the world enough that they don't care to deal with us immediately, and we can get established before they really realize what's going on, type of thing. Like the USA had Napoleon. I mean, without Napoleon, who knows what might happen in the USA. Napoleon actually himself had plans to cross the ocean and conquer the USA. And of course that didn't happen, but Europe was so focused on Napoleon that they didn't have time to come back to invading the US. So maybe if something along that scale could happen, and maybe, not caused by us at all. I'm not saying anything like that. I'm not saying we need to cause any kind of problems, but problems do tend to come about on their own.
Well, we already have a global pandemic on our hands. And one thought that I have is a seastead would be a fairly safe place to live when there's a pandemic. There's de facto immense physical distancing that happens on a seastead.
When the pandemic first started happening, we all in the seasteading community noticed and remarked to each other that suddenly everyone was asking us about seasteading people were super interested in the aspect of seasteading, of getting away from the mainland. And you can even look at the Google search results. Seasteading searches for seasteading during that period started exploding, and we're like, oh wow, maybe there's a market for people who want to live in a society where, you know, like a seasteading community, where they can be sure that everyone does not have COVID. You know, because basically, if you're super freaked out about COVID and you're living in the US right now, where can you go? It's like you can stay at home, but there's nowhere that's like a private community that you could move to and be sure that you're not going to get infected by the next guy who turns the corner. So there's definitely something along that lines possible. And since they're saying now that COVID's basically going to be with us forever in its variants, maybe there's something to that. Maybe there's a market for that. I don't know.
I do think physical distancing is going to be long in humankind's future. There's going to be an alteration of various social norms. Even if people are in direct physical proximity, there won't be as much touching, for example, no handshakes. Instead, the Vulcan greeting as one option. But of course, seasteaders face other risks besides governments and natural disasters. One of our viewers, Alexander Milanchenko, says, how will you defend from pirates? And he clarifies it's not a joke, as we can see there are many crazy things in this world. There are still pirates today off the coast of East Africa, for example, sometimes in the Pacific Ocean. So how would seastead communities deal with them, especially because it might be a kind of realignment of the incentives of pirates? If there are no pirates right now off the western coast of the United States, it may be because the pirates don't have any easy targets. They're afraid of the US Navy. But if there's a seastead off in international waters, the pirates might think, that's a place to rob and maybe get $1 million worth of property. How would seasteads counter that risk?
Well, if we're in a seastead and we're out there by ourselves and we have an economy and a city going, let's say we've got 1,000 or 10,000 people, that's enough to afford full-time protection services from someone. So we would end up starting our own companies or hiring someone to provide on-site security. And in order to have large-scale cities, we would need some kind of law. And since we're talking about non-state, since we're, you know, international waters, we're not even allowed to have a state, which is fine by us. We're talking about creating private cities with private law, which simply means private agreements by contract. So you might have different societies or different legal systems all operating in parallel, which have different answers to this, but maybe, or different laws even, but maybe they group together when it comes to regional security. In Machinery of Freedom, Friedman talked about, I forget if he called it a majority contract or not, but he talked about how you could do regional defense in a private city with a majority contract, which is a contract that has a provision that says, okay, this contract only goes into effect if 95% of the people in this region agree to abide by it. And that extra 5% or 2% or whatever you want to make it is for hardship cases and people who are otherwise unable to pay. And the idea is if you agree to this contract individually, then what you're agreeing to is to pay a monthly subscription at a set rate, and we're going to collectively hire a security firm. And maybe you want up to 3 or more competing security firms for one region, so that none of them can get, you know, total monopoly on the place and threaten to take over or something like that. You always have 2 of them in reserve type of thing. So there are options like that where we can hire our own security. And there's also things called privateers, which the early US also made a lot of use of, which is where you simply authorize private people and private ships to have arms. Now, a privateer was a merchant vessel that had a couple cannons and a bunch of muskets on it. So if the pirates show up, you could effectively defend yourself. But see, the age of piracy was an age of low regional information. What made a pirate able to be a pirate was the fact that he could very quickly escape somewhere and take something and to not be found, really. in an age of high information, I think piracy might be over. I think with satellites giving live feeds of your region, and with the digital technologies that we have to identify people and ships and stuff like that, it might be very, very difficult to get away with piracy anymore. I know that there's oil piracy in the Gulf, around Somalia, stuff like that. And if we look at that, okay, let's say they're doing basically exactly what I'm talking about, where they're putting defenses on the ships. They're using satellites to track. They're using ships to defend against regionally. So I think that even if piracy were to come back like that yeah, submarines can't hide anymore. Yeah, that's probably true as well. It's going to be increasingly difficult to do anything like that. And then with the increasing digitization of goods, it's going to be increasingly difficult to sell anything that they would steal anyway. It may also be that piracy could only thrive if the dollar value of what they can steal is of a certain amount. So it makes good sense to pirate in the Somalian waters, where you can steal an oil vessel that's worth maybe, I don't know, $100 million or something. But if you're doing small merchant vessels, it doesn't seem to make much sense.
So perhaps it wouldn't be worth it for pirates to travel a long way to attack these early seastead communities, especially if they're primarily residential communities, and the people there, for instance, do remote work and they don't have a lot of easily stealable physical capital that the pirates could then resell.
As Friedman says in his book, people will generally pay more to avoid being preyed upon than attackers will pay to prey upon others. Mm-hmm. That's the reason why we have a civilization with security in the first place. If that weren't true, then we would we wouldn't be able to have a civilized society. Mm-hmm. Now, I think the bigger question is, how would we in a seastead prevent a seastead from becoming a haven of piracy against other stuff? And that goes back into this idea of how do we deal with things in private law? And I think that we would have to have laws that say that that if you, well, first of all, we would have to have compatible extradition type stuff for people who do that. Like we're not building seasteads that are going to be havens for crime. We have absolutely no interest in that. We have no interest in being anything that's going to upset nearby nations. In fact, I think that most seasteads would tend to clone the legal concepts of the nations they're closest to in order to be compatible. Like if I'm starting a seastead off the coast of California, I'm basically going to adopt very similar to California law, at least in short form. You know, and if California doesn't want people importing, marijuana made on a seastead to them, we're not going to allow it. At least in the short term, we can't have people purposefully upsetting nation states while we're still trying to get our feet on the ground, type of thing. And I know that a lot of people would accuse seasteaders of wanting to break certain laws, but really it's more a question of freedom and trying out things that have never been done before. It's not that we're in any way lawless or wanting to break certain laws that exist. It's more of a question of we want to do things that would be too slow or automatically prohibited just because they're new. Like,
I have a question. Oh, sorry.
I was just going to say, like the way that the FDA blocks people from taking life-saving drugs just because the FDA hasn't yet approved them, even though they may be approved elsewhere. Anyway, go ahead.
I have a question about the food economy. So it's something that we don't think about much because we're in kind of an overfed nation in many ways. maybe the pandemic is changing that, unfortunately. But so I don't know. It was a couple decades ago. I read a book. It was called The Millennial or the Millennium Project, and it was about steps to actually colonize space. And one of the steps was colonizing like a seasteading sort of community and learning to live off of like phytoplanktons and stuff. It was so you're out there, like you said, you're in a desert of the ocean. Now there's probably rich life down at the bottom of the ocean. We're discovering more and more of that, but in the layers going up to where these communities would live, they're pretty barren. So you might attract fish by having a colony out there, but there was this really interesting.
Sorry, Liz, we lost you there.
Certain
Yes.
vitamins
Oh,
and
you're
then
back.
create.
Sorry, Liz.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Go back a minute. We lost you for a second there.
Oh, sorry about that. So I read this book a couple decades ago, Millennial Project, I think it was, about colonizing space and these different steps. And I believe that what I read was initially was focused on colonizing the ocean. And so, you're talking about being out in barren areas where maybe there's not a lot of fish, but they were talking about cultivating phytoplankton for nutrition. And they had basically a whole plan for how to be completely self-sustaining on what they could grow right there, basically in the sea, carbon neutral. And I was wondering, do you have a plan for food? That would be a really important self-sustaining proposition.
Well, I would say, first of all, that being economically self-sustaining, or at least food-wise self-sustaining, is not a huge goal. The goal is rather to have a give and take economy. So if we can build an economy where you're able to generate, if you're able to generate funds without exchange, basically, like the information economy I was talking about, that's an ideal like first wave economy. But after that, you begin to have demand for secondary services. You got food demands, you've got entertainment, coffee, all these kinds of secondary services would be able to come in after that because people already have money to spend. And then you get third wave stuff that comes in behind them with other kinds of occupations. At that point, you've got much more demand for food than is likely to exist at that point, but you've also got an economy to where you are generating income, and therefore you can buy things from others. Now, most places aren't food secure or food self-generating. Like, probably the closest example to a seastead would be like Las Vegas, and they are nowhere near food secure. Like, they ship in stuff every single day. At the same time, you have a lot of people in the seasteading community who are interested in what we can grow out there. So I know of people working on vertical farm systems. And I've consulted on rotating vertical farm stuff. You have a lot of opportunities for farmed fish, which I'm pretty excited about, actually, because one of the big trends right now is that if we don't stop eating caught fish out there, we're gonna extinct so many fish, and it's like we're this close on the brink to overtaxing what the ocean can provide naturally. And the worst part about that is that fish consumption is only going up from here. And so at least in terms of like shrimp, we've done pretty good as a world. Like, most shrimp is now farm shrimp. It's not wild caught shrimp. We need to move that to fish, but the problem is that the whole world is on this idea of limited catch, and limited catch is not stopping this destruction of these fish stocks. We're going to have to move to farmed fish, but no one wants to do it because farmed fish on land is so expensive. But if we could do farmed fish on deep water, that might change the entire equation. So just for that one thing, in fact, we could probably sell governments on just that. Let's save the world's fish with farmed fish. That might be the one cause that they're cool with.
I really like the cultured meat. So I've been a vegetarian for decades, but I'm more like talking about like self-sustainable culture out there. And I think that was the great thing about the phytoplankton is it has this, rich source of proteins and various other things that you could potentially make into, looking like different food items on your dish, because it would be important, I think, as a selling point that this was carbon neutral. And being a person who's actually tried to live in Hawaii at one point, wanted to move over there, and seeing how completely expensive and it's the highest carbon footprint per person of anyone in the United States, trying to get things to and from there. I think it would be really good to have a plan about how to eat, what to eat, and how the community could be self-sustaining and in the best way possible, just because that would be a huge selling point, being it as a futuristic endeavor.
No, I love it. I have a good friend who's a vegan, and I've spent 4 months as a vegan with her, and I love what's being done with cultured meat right now, and I really enjoy my Carl's Jr. Beyond Famous burger, which is one of the easiest ways to eat vegan meat that you can do right now. And I think there's going to be a lot of opportunities for that. And one of the exciting things to me about the idea of decentralized law and decentralized communities, competitive communities, is that you can create custom law. And this means custom communities can be built instead of today's one-size-fits-all communities. And that opens up possibilities that simply cannot exist in our current world. And one of those that I've thought about that would be desirable are like little communities that are purely vegan, or purely this diet or purely that diet, that cater to that lifestyle directly. It's like, if you cross these boundaries, that every restaurant in here is vegan, or it doesn't have any gluten, or things like that become possible because you have these private societies that can become customized in a way that they really can't right now. And the other thing about living on the ocean is you can infinitely reconfigure cities as much as you want. So, like, take Los Angeles, where I live. You have the 405 freeway, one of the busiest freeways in the world. Why? Because the Los Angeles was designed for 200,000 people, and there's now 20 million people living here. And it would cost $1 billion a mile to change that. But in a seastead, if you had a road that boats like to use that was getting congested, floated apart overnight, make it twice as wide if you want. It doesn't cost much of anything. And I like to think about what are the implications for society and culture if you could live not just where you want, but with who you want. Like right now, we all live with random neighbors. It's just people who could afford to live in that spot, who randomly saw an ad in the paper about the house, whatever. But who would you choose to live with if you could move your house? Would you live with your friends, your family? Would you live closer to work? Would you live in a enthusiast community? Like I could see people making rock climbing communities. And it's like everyone in this community is here because they love rock climbing. That makes socializing super easy. Probably makes finding, a date easier. And you can begin to do public works like that. Maybe they would want to build a public rock climbing park, and the only people they let in are the people who are part of that community, because they know that they're not going to abuse that they have paid their dues into it. So it's not the tragedy of the commons. And excuse me. And so those kinds of custom communities really make me excited as to what the future could hold if we could get that going. I think people would appreciate that so much that just that on its own basis alone might be one of the biggest selling points for seasteading.
Yeah, I don't really mind what people eat in my community, but I think having a carbon neutral community and showing that envisioning maybe even a community that gives back. So, you grow all of these phytoplankton in the case of that book that I read, and it actually generates oxygen for, the planet. It's just kind of a cool idea,
Sure.
That's a little bit more in depth of, if you're going to start all over, why not do it right? Whether you eat meat or not, how can you sustain that? I think that David Attenborough's new documentary that just came out, that basically said, this world cannot sustain 7 billion carnivores. It was never meant for that. That's why the predators are so scarce. And so with bringing back some of that land for farming. So I'm not here on an agenda. I'm not trying to get people not to eat meat, although it would be better for the planet. I'm just saying that if you're going to build a community from scratch, there are a lot of good ideas where maybe people still could partake in some of those behaviors, but it would be more sustainable for the planet. If you're going to start over, why not do it right?
For sure, and I think one of the impetuses for moving onto the ocean is to stop being such a burden on the land and the creatures on the land. I think that people increasingly realize that the ocean is a better place to live than the land if you want to minimize your impact on the world. Especially in the deep, deep waters of the ocean, where it's basically dead right now. It's like living in the Sahara Desert almost. And at the same time, you don't have the same problems out there. I mean, you always have access to water. You always have access to the sun. You don't have to deal with geography, and there's only a few really good places in the world to live because of all the mountainous and geography issues. But on the ocean, it's basically everywhere that's great to live. And on another point, you talked about what you can grow for yourself out there. I think one of the early uses for seasteading might actually be to grow high value off-season crops just offshore of large cities that would otherwise have to import from the other hemisphere. So for instance, if you had, like, let's say you had Portland, and Portland's very cold, but it wants summer fruits and vegetables. You might be able to do climate controlled farming right off on the ocean, and in that way grow summer vegetables in winter. And because they would be high value vegetables with an immediate market, you get the best of both worlds, like immediately fresh ingredients that haven't been shipped 3,000 miles. And then that trend just snowballs into what you're talking about, which is long term. If people become more and more conscious about the impact that they're having on the planet, we begin to demand more foods that have less of an impact. And if you did have like a seasteading farm that's enclosed, you don't have to deal with insects, for instance. So you don't have to have pesticides, and then that's automatically something that, like every vegetable you make on the ocean without pesticides is one you don't have to make on the land with pesticides. And then if we can start moving farmland onto the water, where simply having the sun turn salt water into fresh water gives you all the water you need, no matter where you are, you don't have to worry about the aquifers on land and all the problems that come with that.
And Alexandria Black asks, is it possible to have a fish farm right under the seastead, or would you rather envision them to be offset from the seasteading community by a little bit?
It's definitely possible. I don't know if that would be ideal. It's probably more likely to have them separated because fish farms take up a lot of space. It'd be more likely to have a shrimp farm under a seastead, since the shrimp farms I've seen can be done in a rather compact amount of space. There are advantages to doing deep water fish farms. If you do nearshore salmon farms, for instance, they have this big problem with sea lice, but it's purely because of how close to the shore they are. When you move them out into deep water, they don't have the sea lice problem, and it's just too expensive to keep anything out there right now. So it's just the first person who solves that problem, suddenly the entire world is going to have fish farms all over the world in deep water. So can you demonstrate it? And if you can demonstrate it, everyone else will do it. I think that's what seasteading to me is like. This is like a boiling concept, and once it gets demonstrated, it's just going to be an explosion of activity. And people are going to like, I try to think of all these applications, and I've thought of many, but I think there's a lot out there that I haven't yet thought of. Mm-hmm. Okay, someone says, Alexandria says, talking about sovereignty.
Yes, sovereignty. She says it seems that sovereignty is the key issue. Change gets slowed when we don't have the agency to try new things.
Yeah, one of my favorite things about these decentralized law concepts and the idea of doing parallel experiments is the pace of change that's possible. I mean, you take the state and you have this, especially in the United States, where we have this winner takes all political system. And you have typical political rhetoric that says, well, here's what we did, and it would have been much worse if the other guys had done something else. But you can never prove that because they never got the chance to try. And every time a politician gets in hot water, they say, yeah, well, it would have been a lot worse if we'd done what that guy said we should do. And it's just an empty claim. But the amount of political evolution that occurs under our current systems is glacial at best. And in custom communities based on private law, there's two great things about it. One, it really boils down to individual consent rather than mass votes. Like, you don't need democracy in a seastead necessarily. You could employ it, but you don't need it because individual choice gives you everything that democracy has and more. And also the fact that private law out there would be based on individual agreement means that laws die as people die, which means that political evolution resets in a sense with each new generation and each new person. Like, you're not bound by the decisions of the past necessarily. And if you were born into a seasteading society that you wanted out from, you could literally go out with some friends and start a new one next door, because there's plenty of space for that, and there's no reason to stop you, because we're not talking about state systems. We're talking about private systems and systems that are primarily concerned with consent and individual choice rather than anything else. So if you want out, you're out. And if you want to start a new thing, start a new thing. That kind of nimbleness that gives you should allow for things that we can't currently imagine, in the same way that when the internet was invented, we could not imagine social media, or we could not imagine YouTube or stuff like that. None of us will be like seasteading natives, but I'm curious to see what happens when there are seasteading natives and what they do with that kind of freedom.
Yes, I had an interesting conversation yesterday with Andreas Xertus, and he and I talked about future trajectories for technological development. And I pointed out that sometimes the convergence of new technologies creates possibilities that we can't anticipate from our current vantage point. That is one of the key ideas behind the notion of a technological singularity, or a horizon beyond which we cannot foresee what changes will happen. But I do think with seasteading and some of the synergies that it would have with other technologies, we could see these kinds of possibilities emerge as well. Indeed, we had a bit of a glimpse into that with our discussion about cryonics, which was quite innovative and has led me to think about what a cryonics patient might actually experience in a very different way from how I had envisioned cryonic suspension previously. So that is one example. Now, another area of technology that I think is worthwhile to discuss is molecular nanotechnology. And one of our commentators in the chat, Sergio Terrero, said that he thinks seasteads will be a lot more viable once we have molecular nanotechnology, but he thinks they're very hard to do sustainably before then. He notes as an example of molecular nanotechnology desktop nanofactories and the like. He thinks international laws will apply to that area as well. And Pavel Ilin, our secretary, has a question along these lines as well. He asks, what are your thoughts on nanofabrication technologies like Eric Drexler's nanoassembler? How close are we to having these technologies, and how can they be used not just to construct, but grow cities under the water or on the water, atom by atom? Do you think that will be a realistic possibility in our future?
I think some aspects of that are possible. I think that the best nanoassembler that we've encountered is the living cell. And I think at some point we will be able to take control of epigenetic factors that control the form that cells are able to build. Basically the same way that a cell tells itself to build a human body, you could reprogram it to build a large structure. And taking control of that kind of biotechnology might be the best way for us to create a nanoassembler rather than using some other kind of technology. Especially if we were trying to 3D print it atom by atom. You do the math on that, and you found that the print head would have to move faster than a 700-mile-per-hour jet or something like that, just to do anything of substance. People don't generally have a good concept of just how small atoms are and how small even cells are. Like, you ask someone how many atoms are in a cell, just off the top of your head, a lot of people will say 100 atoms, or maybe 1,000 atoms, or maybe 10,000 atoms. No. It's more like trillions of atoms. A cell in complexity is about similar to the complexity of an entire city, rather than being something very simple. And so even thinking about how to do a nanoassembler of just one cell is almost unfathomable to us. But maybe I'll just throw this in there, but one of the transhumanist technologies I'm most interested in is the ability to freeze the brain and then scan it atom by atom, or maybe molecule by molecule, and then reconstruct that digitally, and there you have a human brain in the machine. And we're getting very, very close to being able to do that. And that might be one of the best ways to download people into machines. But at that point, you need to have a very good physical simulation in order to actually run that physical program that results in computation. But maybe you could take that map and then deconstruct it into connections that you then turn into like a synapse map that you could then turn into apply to a digital brain that would run that. And now you have man in the machine. So
and it's interesting along these lines. Before you continue, we had an extensive virtual Enlightenment Salon with Kenneth Hayworth and Robert McIntyre on the subject on September 27th of last year, where we discussed this topic and its potential, as well as some possible pitfalls and issues for 3 hours and 47 minutes. So I urge our viewers to check it out, but please proceed.
So could we build things using nanoassemblers? I think we can, but I think they will tend to be biological based. And I don't see any reason that we could not do that. And I think that actually could turn into a manufacturing revolution, because at some point in the near future, rather than buying structures, you might simply buy seeds of structures, or you might simply buy a design for a structure that you then program into a cell that you already have, and you simply plant that and give it carbon and oxygen, and it grows into the structure that you're looking for. Whether that's a cell phone or a large structure like a seastead, even, there's no reason you couldn't have a large organism that builds the bones of a seastead and then dies and just leaves behind a large concrete structure that it put together. There's absolutely no reason why that couldn't happen. It's just a matter of, can we get a handle on the way the genetics work to actually do that? And I think we're going to need very strong AI in order to do that. That's all. It's just going to take very strong AI in order to figure out those genetic systems, to be able to control what shape they come out in. And then it'll be this nice new era of, oh, look what we can do. We can grow roads.
Yes, indeed. And it's interesting too, in our YouTube chat, Daniel Twet provides another technological possibility. He writes that corals use bioelectric currents to accrete dissolved materials out of solution. And this has been demonstrated by Wolf Hilberts and others for electrodeposition structures. So perhaps you don't even require nanoassemblers in order to build these kinds of structures piece by piece, essentially.
Yeah, I knew about that. I think they call it biocrete technology. I hadn't heard that corals actually use the same system. But my problem with that technology is that you're building out of calcium compounds, and it's those same compounds that the ocean is very, very good at eroding. And the people who want to build out a biocrete say, well, you just keep running electricity through the structure and it keeps bioaccreting. And I'm not sure how I feel about that, especially not while I have a material that I know I can just pour, this geopolymer material that I can pour, and it's already very, very low calcium and is not going to be subject to being attacked by the ocean. So I leave that technology and exploration to others. I'm not that interested in that for building seasteads while I've got such a great technology already. But
All right.
Is it possible? Yeah, it's probably possible.
Mm-hmm. And it does seem like there are many technological pathways for the development of seasteads. And one aspect of experimentation will be not just with the governance and kinds of societies that emerge there, but also the kinds of techniques that are used to construct seasteads. And Pavel also says in our internal chat, ribosomes are natural nanoassemblers which synthesize proteins in the cells. So there's an analog within the human body to how that could be deployed. Now, I'm curious if Art Ramon has a question for Michael.
As far as energy storage, have you looked into solar electrolysis of seawater to create hydrogen gas and store hydrogen gas to use for backup energy, electrical production, as well as a backup water source?
Yeah, you could totally do that. But it's what they call that is brown gas. So, well, you can either leave it mixed or you can separate it. But it's a lot. Is it more deadly or less deadly when it's mixed? I can't remember. Basically, you do electrolysis, and on one electrode you're going to get hydrogen, on the other one you're going to get oxygen coming out, and you can either mix those together in what's called brown gas. So brown gas is at ideal proportions to burn, but you don't really need to store it as brown gas because you've already got oxygen in the environment. So you could just store the hydrogen and burn that whenever you want. Is what Art's talking about. There is a lot of work on the hydrogen economy, and it could definitely be done, but it's still cutting edge. So it's too soon for me to plan on. I really have to build off the shelf as much as possible when it comes to energy, because we're talking about possibly building this thing within 5 years. When I say thing, I mean a seasteading city. So I can't wait for that technology to be mainstreamed while I'm planning an actual structure now. And with floating solar being so good already, it's just a no-brainer to go straight for that. But I love the idea of exploring other options like that, especially when it comes to storage of energy, like you're talking about. Like if you have excess electric capacity, it makes perfect sense. You just electrolyze it. I mean, even with the 30% loss you're taking on that process, which is very energy intensive, seawater is almost a perfect medium for electrolysis. And you get a lot of result out of it as opposed to pure water. So yeah, absolutely. And what's more, with my floating breakwaters made from the float houses, I'm going to have a lot of, empty space that I can fill with something.
Now, your floating home houses, what sort of insulation do they have? Because it gets pretty cold out at sea.
For sure. There's two main things I want to do. One, most people familiar with a sailboat know that they have moisture problems. They have water vapor goes right through fiberglass. Like they have almost no protection at all from water vapor, and they'll get a lot of accumulation, kind of like the way that you have a cold water glass on a table will start to accumulate water on the side of it. So they have that problem, but we actually want to incorporate a vapor barrier into the float house itself. So first of all, we're going to have a vapor barrier, and then behind that, I want to put foamed geopolymer. And foamed geopolymer has an R value almost as high as like a good quality fiberglass insulation, is what I would say. So there is room in the bottom sections of this structure to put fiberglass against the hull, and we have if you go on my website and look at the actual design of the structure, it has waste tanks in the center on the bottom so that you have access to the hull. And that's one of the reasons, is so that we can insulate that effectively. But by using geopolymer, we don't have any problem with fire risks, and its long-term stability is great. And you can jump on it without destroying it, unlike fiberglass insulation. And we're not using plastic or anything like that, not foam, you know. And it just works. So.
And what about waste disposal? How do you plan on taking care of that?
So it's really going to depend on what context you're using a float house. If you bought a float house, let's say within the next 3 years, and you just wanted to either anchor out or live in a marina, you're most likely to use the same kind of waste disposal systems that a simple sailboat uses. There's waste tanks on the actual float house itself, significant ones, but you're likely to use a pump out service, or if you're in a marina, to simply hook up to their sewer. Like that all is possible and in there. And then long term, what we want to do is, when we have an actual seastead, to have a sewage service, because it's going to be cheaper for people to have a more of a municipal style centralized sewage service. But if you wanted, we're going to make it possible for people to treat their own. So you have excess rooms in the downstairs, and there are things called aerators that you can buy, which are about the size of 2 washing machines, and they will treat human waste and completely neutralize it with bacteria. And it's completely legal, according to world authorities, to dump that waste at sea once it's been neutralized. And that's a much better option. It just turns into fish food at that point, but it's a better option than what the cruise ships do. They literally get out in international waters and they just dump it untreated, because you're also allowed to do that. But you can't do that when we're talking about permanent living and seasteading scales, the type of scales that we're talking about. Like, I could easily see a seasteading city with 1 billion people out there. You're not going to be dumping raw sewage in a city of 1 billion people. And as for toilet paper, we're going to have to come up with some kind of toilet paper that's like fish food or something, or probably even better than that, just switch to bidets permanently. It's like no more point in toilet paper.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
So I'm curious, with regard to the structures that you're designing, the float houses, would it be conceivable to arrange a large number of float houses essentially in a string extending far out into the ocean, and have them be made into a pedestrian track, like a walking or running track? Perhaps some of them would have transparent domes overhead so that people could have views of the ocean.
Yeah, that'd be possible for sure. We've thought about things like that when it comes to transporting a large number of these into places. You could line them up in a string like that. And when it comes to things like creating bridges between islands or seasteading islands, like, you might have scenarios where people want to have some physical distance as well as having a legal separation between them, maybe for noise reasons. And also, we're going to have floating breakwaters, which basically have to surround the entire city. And it makes sense to build districts off of the edge of that. And so that's going to function exactly what you're talking about. It's going to be a transport hub. It's going to be a community center hub, all that kind of stuff. And that'll most likely, the floating breakwater itself will probably be company owned, and then people will individually own structures that they dock on company space. And that would be, for what I mean, like a very first seastead. In the future, I would expect people to branch out and do their own thing, and that'd be great. But yeah, totally doable. I think, is it Norway that recently is building an underwater, like it's building a suspended tube like this, like just under the water, like 20 feet underwater, as a driving bridge between fjords. I saw something about that being proposed recently. Someone sent it to me and was like, it looks just like what you're making. Another concept along those lines was someone said what we should do is pitch this to the UN as transportable housing for emergency situations, and just put them in long strings, like long trains like you're talking about, and they would be able to travel pretty efficiently on that basis. And you just have these things ready to go anywhere in the world that needs emergency housing, and you can just drag them up on the shore and basically live there permanently until they're done with them.
Yes, indeed. And that's a fascinating possibility as well. And of course, I myself would greatly enjoy running on a track on the ocean surface.
Yes.
That would definitely be a new experience and a fascinating one. Now, Alexandria Black wants to take it a bit further, and she asks, how about a bullet train and we dock alongside the track? Do you think that will ever be feasible with seasteads?
Bullet train on the ocean. I think that's unlikely, just because of how non-stationary everything on the ocean has to be, whereas a bullet train really requires a really good foundation that's not going to move significantly. Oh man, I had the pleasure of experiencing bullet trains in Japan, and there was one time that we got off. Well, we were actually getting onto the bullet train, but we were in a weird station, and the bullet train came through at 200 kilometers per hour and didn't stop at the station. It was just like, man, that was thrilling. But I recommend, if you're in Japan, try to see that. It's just incredible. But rather than bullet trains on the water, we might see them under the water, because the funny thing is that you can actually go really, really fast under the water if you take a couple steps to reduce the friction with the water. What you can do is actually at the nose of the craft, let's say you have like a submarine underwater or something like that, you can trail bubbles, and the bubbles will dramatically reduce the amount of friction you have with the water. And so for that period of time, while you have, I guess, compressed air, you can travel very, very quickly under the water, and you can even break the sound barrier under the water. So some kind of bullet train concept is possible, just not a bullet train, maybe like a bullet torpedo or a bullet submarine or something like that. You wouldn't need a track. It could literally just go anywhere. But should you do it? I'm not sure, because let's say you hit a whale. That's not going to be good. Not for anyone.
Yes, indeed. One can't really anticipate some of the floating obstacles in one's way underneath the ocean surface. Now, Zach Richardson is curious to find out more about geopolymer concrete. What else can you tell us about that technology?
Geopolymer concrete came out of France back in the 70s, and there's a whole institute there that they've been studying it and pushing it ever since. And even though it's been around for so long, like practically no one's ever used it or done much with it, because the construction industry is extremely conservative, very much tied to state contracts, where they want to have a whole lot of experience with something before they begin incorporating it. And because of that, it's not well known, and it's even less well played with. And then you have there's two different kinds of geopolymer concrete. There's type F that I'm playing with, and there's type C. And type C is more like regular concrete, and I'm dealing with the one that's even unusual for geopolymer. So when I started playing with geopolymer, it's like I poured it, I got materials for it, and it was rare even to have it. It was like this material, almost like mythological in a sense. And actually, let me see. I've got some. Yeah, hold on. Be right back. I'll grab some.
All right. We are looking forward to a demonstration of geopolymer concrete.
So here's some geopolymer concrete that I poured. I don't know how well you can see that.
Yes, we can see it quite well. So is it hard like concrete inside the cup?
It's actually stronger than concrete. It's pretty easy to get stronger than concrete. So the concrete that's on the sidewalk outside that you might experience normally, that's a pretty low PSI concrete, maybe like 1200 PSI. Whereas this kind of stuff, even just pouring it as a hobby, I was able to get up to 5,000 PSI, which is beginning to be like a super concrete. And then some people have gotten it as high as 12,000 PSI. And then for what I'm doing, I don't need a super strong PSI concrete, but it's nice to know that this material is very strong light concrete. But also relevant for my purposes in building a float house, it's 5 times more flexible than regular concrete before it cracks. That's a big deal. And there's a couple other properties of it that make it ideal for what I'm doing. Like ones we mentioned already, it's extremely good against chemical infiltration and does not get broken down by seawater. So it achieves that by having extremely low calcium. That's what the type F fly ash does for the geopolymer. It makes it extremely low calcium so that the seawater chemistry does not attack it. And then from there, if you just don't use steel rebar, it's going to survive. You know, I've taken a lot of lessons from the concrete sailboat craze back in the 70s. I don't know, maybe most people aren't familiar with this, but there was this big craze of building sailboats in your backyard. Everyone was like, oh, concrete's so cheap and blah, blah, blah. And so they built all these concrete sailboats back then. And I think one of them still exists. You know, most of them rusted through within 10 or 15 years, but we want to avoid that fate.
Yes, indeed. And I'm curious, can this geopolymer concrete also be used on land, for instance, to repair cracks in sidewalks?
Yeah, you would probably use type C for that, but there's a lot of use of it down in Australia right now, actually. Also in India. In a couple places like that where it's been tried out, it's proven to be quite good. It also cures very quickly and does not require additional water to cure, which regular concrete does. So that's one of the big things that's great about it from a certain scenarios. Like, let's say you want to repair a runway, which is what they've done down in Australia. They've investigated it for runway repair because it can cure very quickly within just a couple hours, up to 24 hours, depending on the amount of heat it has. But it not requiring water and being more flexible, it's a pretty big deal for that. And then I think they built an entire building out of it down in Australia. You can find details on.
Yes, that is quite fascinating. Now, go ahead.
The basic material is fly ash, which is a byproduct of coal burning, and most of it is being thrown away today. So it's a waste material, and it doesn't generate CO2 because the CO2 has already been generated by the coal burning, basically. So for every block of this stuff I use, every pound of this I use rather than regular concrete is a pound of carbon that's not going into the air, because regular concrete is pound to pound on carbon release.
Yes, indeed. And it does seem like there is a building made out of a geopolymer concrete in Queensland, Australia. It is the University of Queensland's Global Change Institute building. So I will provide a link to an article about that in the YouTube chat. We have another question from the YouTube chat from Daniel Holting, who asks, is there any concern about fish farm escapes into the diverse native fish gene pool from your seasteads? Or do you largely think because it's out in mostly a dead zone in the ocean, there wouldn't be that much interaction with the native fish populations?
I think we would tend to raise fish that are native to that area to deal with that mainly. You obviously would need to worry about cross-contamination if you were trying to raise a certain kind of fish in an area where them getting out would be bad. Like, that would never even get off the ground to begin with, because there's absolutely no way that you're not going to have accidental release of fish. You are going to have it, and you have to plan for that accordingly. So yes, absolutely plan for all your fish to get out at some point. and because of that, don't even start the risk in the first place. The wild stocks now are so low compared to what they used to be that even a large release of fish, it's not like we would overpopulate the ocean ever with this kind of thing. The bigger risk that I've heard people talk about is actually for algae farming, which to feed these fish, there would be a lot of algae farming. And one of the most clever systems I read about was someone proposing an algae farm. They wanted to do actually biofuel. They wanted to grow algae as a form of obtaining the oils from the algae to turn into biofuel. And their system was, okay, we don't want to have large releases of algae because that would lead to ocean eutrophication, which is where the algae eat all the oxygen and then it creates this dead zone that just floats with the stream and it kills all the fish it runs into. It's a really bad thing. So their clever system was, okay, they're going to take bags of plastic that were thin enough to exchange gases with the ocean, and they would put fresh water into these bags along with freshwater algae. And fresh water floats on salt water, so the bags would flatten out on the surface of the salt water, collect the sunlight, and then gas exchange with the ocean underneath them. And by this means, you could grow massive amounts of freshwater algae on the ocean. You collect the bags and recycle them. And I'm not going to say if you have a release, when you have an accident and those algae get out, because they're freshwater algae, they just instantly die in the salt water and turn into fish food. So that's an example, I would say, of responsible way to do this kind of farming. Because in that scenario, there's no bad scenario. There's no like, oh, the algae got out and they killed everyone and killed all the fish and now we have a big problem. No. It's the algae got out. It's okay. We continue on. If anything, our accident made the world better. And that's the kind of way that I think we can begin building stuff. Like I think seasteads in the future might actually demand that no one bring like long-term living plastics onto the seastead. We just have a rule. It's like, okay, things coming in that are packaged in plastic, we repackage them in, let's say, PTFE, or repackage them as silicone, something that is not a problem if and when it ever gets into the environment.
Very interesting. Now, we have a lot of questions about properties of geopolymer concrete. So Alexandria Black asks, is it similar in weight to regular concrete? And Daniel Twett asks, is it the same density as ordinary concrete? So how would that compare?
It is the same weight and it is the same density, yes.
All right. And Daniel Holting asks, might this material help in the construction of massive projects like bridges from Russia to America or Korea to Japan?
Yeah, right now, the construction industry generally and typically will design a concrete bridge to last about 50 to 75 years. And right now, because of the effect of water infiltration, they will generally add 1 inch of extra concrete for every 10 years that they want that structure to survive before water gets to the reinforcement, which is the steel reinforcement on the inside. Once water hits the steel reinforcement, you have a couple of years until the reinforcement rusts and begins spalling off concrete and the structure will fail. So that's how the construction industry is currently dealing with the problem of how to create reinforced concrete structures that survive for at least 50 to 70 years. Now, could they start building in geopolymer? Yeah, but none of them want to be the first guy to do it, because if there was some unforeseen failure, who knows? So that project down in Queensland was one of the first attempts to try to change that. In theory, we could build concrete bridges out of geopolymer using non-steel rebar that could last over 100 years easily, maybe even 500 years, maybe even longer. I mean, how long has certain Roman structures been up and running? But the reason politicians don't want to do that is, one, they don't want to be the first guy to change the system and take responsibility. And two, they're only going to be in office for the next 20 years. What do they care about the next 100 and 200 years? So you've got this incentive problem of where the people who have to authorize and pay for this kind of thing have to take a hit, but they don't derive any personal benefit. And I think if we changed up the political system to where, like what we're talking about with decentralized law and communities run by the people who are in them, they might have more of an interest in spending money that's going to last longer term. So by changing the political incentives, you can change what material people build out of. But for the short term, I don't really see the construction industry changing anytime soon, because the natural conservativeness of that industry that doesn't want to change, doesn't want to do new things. And some of the other issues are that it's slightly more expensive, and it would require a slightly different supply chain, and it's less forgiving. This stuff, it's not like concrete where you add 3 shovels of cement and then 2 shovels of rock and one shovel of sand, and then you throw some water in there. That was one of the first big lessons when I started playing with it. Was I having been involved in building, was familiar with concrete, but this stuff is not like concrete. I did all kinds of pours and testing where I would change the amount of sand, the amount of cement, the amount of water. And in cement, you could do that and it wouldn't be horrible. But with geopolymer, if you didn't get the mixture correct within a certain ratio percentages, the pour would actually fail. So it's less forgiving. And then 2, you have to deal with caustic chemicals. So you do have to put lye into this, and the lye actually dissolves the rock and turns it into like a liquid rock form that then through a series of chemical changes becomes this new solid structure of inorganic polymer. And so if you can imagine a bunch of construction workers trying to mix caustic chemicals in, it's a lot more risky and a lot more expensive in terms of risk. If you get the stuff in your eye, you're blind. And if you get it on your hand, you have to immediately wash it or you get a chemical burn. It's stuff like that. It can be pretty bad. And so that risk too of it being more crazy about the mixture ratios, and then the fact that you have to use actually more caustic chemicals, it's just a succession of things that make it less and less likely that they're going to change anytime soon.
Do you think it would help to have more robots involved in the construction process so that humans don't have to be directly handling the material? The robots could be programmed to make it using the precise doses of ingredients and then to apply it. And of course, robot can't really get chemical burns in the same way that a human, it wouldn't be permanently put out of commission from.
Sure, that makes a ton of sense.
To that. Mm-hmm.
That makes a ton of sense. I would expect that to happen within the next 100 years, for sure. And we have someone saying, would steel rebar be replaced by any form of graphene or graphite? Not immediately, because graphene is still stupid expensive, especially in rebar form. But the funny thing is that there's no reason for it to be expensive. Carbon is a very inexpensive material. You can pull it out of the air if you want. And it's mainly the newness and the newness of the processes that make it expensive now. So I would expect graphene and some form of graphene rebar to be available probably within the next 50 or 100 years. But another thing that can be used right now is actually, what's it called? Basalt rebar. If you look at that up, Google basalt rebar, and they're actually taking stone, melting it, and then running it through a palladium dye. So they come out with like a very thin strand, and they have a fiber that they create out of it. And this stuff is extremely resistant chemically, and it's almost as strong as rebar, but unfortunately for my purposes, it has a lot of calcium in it still. And it also doesn't have any kind of stretch factor. You stretch it, it'll just snap, which isn't great for my purpose, but could be great for other purposes.
Now, one final question about geopolymer concrete from Daniel Holting. What would be the use of this material for building better roads? Is that another possible application?
Probably not. What you have with roads right now is almost an ideal material because it's almost completely recyclable and it has a lot of give. I think a lot of people don't understand how great asphalt is out there. Like literally, it's almost like 99% recycled, and the material it's made out of is just ideal for what it's doing. I don't think there's any way to improve on that, honestly. The big thing about roads is, do you have land that is sufficiently stable that you could pour it once? You go to Germany and they've got the Autobahn, and they've got these amazing roads, and it's because they dig 20 feet down and they put a really good foundation on it because they know it's not going anywhere. Here in California, with all the seismic activity, we can't do that. So they figure they're going to resurface the road every 3 to 5 years, and that's just how they have to live with it. There's a place near to me that's actually falling into the ocean over time. It's like right next to the water. It's this road about 100 feet from the ocean, and ever since I was a kid, it's been moving. So the road is like really curved right now, and when I was a kid, it was straight. And they literally have pipelines above the dirt because it moves so quick. It moves like a couple inches a year or something like that. There's water pipelines on the dirt with like flexible things. And it's funny stuff.
Yes, that's quite interesting to consider. There are some Roman roads that are still in good condition today because the Romans did dig down deep and construct multiple layers underneath the surface of the roads. And it does seem like the terrain, the geography matter a lot in terms of whether one is able to do that. So that's why the US roads get repaved so often and the Roman roads can largely function left alone on their own. Very interesting. So Mike Lazine had a series of observations that I was hoping you could address with regard to affordability of a seastead lifestyle. And especially because your concept is to make these float houses available to H-1B visa applicants who are talented people, but not the wealthiest people at the time they're seeking their visas. Do you believe this could be affordable to a middle-class person in the relatively near future?
Yeah, my concept was you would be able to sell a house that you have and use your equity in it to buy one of these, most likely, and take a loan for it just like any other house in the US. And these would probably be cheaper than most houses anyway, at least when I can get them down to mass market. And that concept went along with the idea of, yeah, you can take your furniture out and use your furniture with the new float house. So we want to have like a full kitchen like you would expect in any house, with a walk-in pantry, with a kitchen island. There's probably enough room in that kitchen for 4 or 5 people to work at once. There's a dining room, there's a living room with space for couches and stuff like that. It's designed to be as little compromise as possible. And if we can get these seasteads going, there shouldn't be a lot of difference or difficulty in moving to one, like as if you were moving any city. Like if you were moving states or moving city to city, you should be able to move with about the same amount of effort into a seastead. Same effort and cost, I would say. But then you've got all these other benefits of you get to live wherever you want, you get to choose your neighbors, and you get to live in a tax-free scenario. At least free of state taxes, not free of all costs. But
and you said that some of these would have square footage around 2,900 square feet, correct?
Yeah, if you wanted like a single family float house, which is designed for at least 4 people, then we're talking 2 floors, 2,900 square feet. But we have other configurations designed to cut that down. For instance, we could cut it down to where you have a wall in the middle, so that we have one float house made into 2 sections. So that would be more like a condominium. Or we could cut it down so we have 3 or 4 sections. So I think 4 is about the most that we could cut, 4 condominiums out of one structure, and then everyone would get a front door and a top floor and a bottom floor. And the bottom floor would be like for services and laundry and stuff like that, and waste tank. And then the top floor would be for living and hanging out and stuff, like kitchen, all that kind of stuff. So we could do that. Another thing we came up with was, what is the maximum we could possibly do? And at the time I was in Japan, and Japan has these not capsule houses, but they're for businessmen who just need a place to stay overnight. Like they stay at work too long and they just need a cheap place to stay. And I was there, let's see, I was there in the early 2000s and it was $35 a night in Tokyo, if you can believe that. And it's just, you get a door and you get about maybe a 3 foot by 3 foot square behind the door. And then behind that is a 6 foot, I would say 7 foot by 4 foot area. And that's where you sleep, which is a tatami mat. And then there's a refrigerator next to the door and a TV on top of the refrigerator and an air conditioner in a window. And it's called a ryokan. And a ryokan is designed to give you the absolute minimum amount of living space for overnight for like the cheapest possible price. And it's a shared toilet down the hallway and shared kitchen spaces. But the living room, I mean, the room that you live in is incredibly tiny and just there for you to sleep. No bed, just a little mat for you to sleep on. And it was great. And it was $35 a night. And when I came back in 2019, it was still $35 a night. So I think we could do something like that to where people who want to move there and experience it and don't have a lot of money could live short term in a ryokan while they're getting oriented and deciding what they want to do. So I'm trying to accommodate as many scenarios like that as possible. And if you figure top floor and bottom floor, if you configured it all as a ryokan, then potentially you could get like 90 people living in one structure. So it really starts to multiply.
What do you think would be the initial price range for, say, a 2,900 square foot float house, and how would it compare to real estate prices in the Bay Area, which are, of course, astronomically high on land?
Right. That's one of the reasons why we're targeting the Bay Area, because not only do they have the housing crisis and a lot of water, but high real estate prices. So when I first started talking about the structure and people started asking me about prices, they always told me to raise my prices. They're like, oh, you're not charging enough. You need to charge more. We're going to focus on the high end of that market to start with so that we can try to finance the company as quickly as possible. And there's a lot of opportunities for cutting the price, the production price, and making it cheaper on the production side. But we don't know exactly how much strength we need right now in the structure. So we're overbuilding. And we're going to target the high end of the San Francisco markets. They're charging $2,000 for, 2,000 square feet. They're paying like $1 million a house right now. It's ridiculous. And it's I think it's going up like $700 a day, they said, or something like that. God, that was a year ago I read that article. So who knows what it is now. But I'm thinking probably around 800,000 to start. And we're going to target to try to be competitive with those $1 million houses. And there's a lot of people that just want to live in this kind of thing there just because it would allow them to be closer to San Francisco. Like that for them is the key selling feature. Like there's marinas right in San Francisco available, or you could anchor out, stuff like that. But I rapidly want to get them down below 200,000. So I've got a plan for both of those. One, how do we make it in the first place with limited help and funds? And then once the company is actually up and running and we've sold a couple of them, how do we create a high volume production process that is going to bring the price way, way, way down? Luckily, the actual material cost is not high. And the most expensive production will be the production we're doing right now in the beginning. And I'm very hopeful we're going to get these mass market, and I want as many people to live in one of these as possible, and I want cities out there. We're going to start building them on the ocean. I want to build a much larger one, maybe one that's like a 40-foot diameter, and then create a production for the smaller one inside of it. That's one of my goals. And if we could build the 40-foot diameter one, that's like as big as an office building. So that's like one we could do for commercial type stuff. And then we also want to try to adapt it as a float for flat structures on top of it, for flat space on top. So we can have the float house as a float with flat space on top of it, able to create commercial structures on top of that and city centers and stuff like that. So it's not just a bunch of pods out in the water, but you can actually have flat space similar to an actual city. But it's a lot of dreams that we have right now, and we have to actualize that first step before we can really start focusing on those second ones. So I've had about 5 people say, if you had one right now, I'd buy it. And they didn't even ask me what the price was. But that gives me some hope that once we start building these, there's going to be a market for them. And once there is, we're off to the races.
Yes, I definitely think there's enough enthusiasm around seasteading that once viable structures are available for people to purchase, you will have enough of that initial demand. Now, David, you had some questions about quality of life aboard a seastead. Would you be willing to pose them?
Yeah, certainly. So I'm thinking, this is great if I had one of your places and I'm moored in the Bay Area.
Mhm.
But if I'm 50 miles out at sea, I'm looking at what quality of life out there, and it occurred to me that Elon Musk's Starlink satellites is an enabler of sorts in that area, because it now provides me with internet, would allow me to be able to do what I'm doing right now. So I'm curious what other kind of enabling technologies there might be for quality of life. So I was fantasizing about long-range delivery drones that could do individual deliveries from land instead of waiting for a supply ship or something like that to come in. And I was wondering if you've given any thought to that, as people have thought about moving out onto the ocean. What would they do to not have that that isolation that might otherwise be there?
No, absolutely. Starlink, when they announced that, we said, hey, there it is, one of the solutions we've been waiting for. How do we get internet all around the world? Well, I mean, Starlink so far is a good technology. It probably is not enough for a knowledge worker. So for that seastead city off of San Francisco, we're looking at either projected internet from land, which would use a tower on site to collect a signal being projected from land, a high bandwidth signal that way, or actually running a cable underneath the water to the city, which is probably the more likely scenario. And that gives you all the speed you could ask for. And there's no reason you can't do that anywhere in the ocean. That's the same way that places like Tonga and Tahiti are getting high-speed internet. They just simply paid a company to drag a high-speed internet line to them. Long-range delivery drones, yes. Like, drones on the ocean are great. I mean, you can literally just have a boat and tell it to go, go here, and give it some minor intelligence on how to avoid other boats, and it'll just do it. It's fantastic opportunities there for drones on the ocean, like totally untapped. Like, we want to create drones that would police the city and catch anything that gets dropped into the water. Like, someone throws some napkin in the ocean, all this drone does is hover around and catch anything that gets dropped like that, and deliver it to actual trash bins. High-speed surface vessels. You know what? There's 2 things about seasteading that are great for cargo. One, obviously, like I was saying, like the ability to transport cargo on the ocean is 2% of the cost of transporting on land. But people played around with concepts like, what if you did a ground effect transport vehicle? I mean, in theory, it's possible, but is there any cargo that's expensive enough and important enough to justify that? I don't know. And then the other aspect is that we've heard from countries saying that they want to begin pre-checking in their cargo before it gets to their land ports. So let me give you an example. Like, I live here in a port town. I live in San Pedro here, which is just off of Los Angeles. It's the port for Los Angeles. And something like 40% of the US economy comes through here. I used to work for the Port of Los Angeles doing a PR. I would write their news briefs and stuff like that. And so I'm pretty familiar with what they do down there. And they have the problem of, how do we deal with not just contraband coming in, but what they're really worried about is a nuclear attack that's in one of these cargo containers, because that would disrupt their entire port for a very long time. So what the Port of Los Angeles would like to do, and basically every other port in the world, they want to check out, like run a nuclear test on every piece of cargo coming through their port every day, which they currently can't do. They do nuclear testing on their current cargo, but it's only about 10% of containers they actually do it on, and they're doing it on site. So if it just blew up right there, they're already screwed. So we already know that states want to do this, and we might be able to offer a solution through seasteading. We could say, okay, we're going to offer you like pre-check ports on the water, or even imagine a pre-check port that travels with a ship and is giving is checking out those containers as the ship moves. And to do that, you would probably have to actually move the containers off the ship. And why not just load them into vessels that can autonomously then move into the port, and just, you don't even need a port anymore, really. You're just undocking at sea. And if you can do that, then you can change world shipping. And there's reasons to do it, not just cost, but like I said, the desire to have every one of these things checked for nuclear problems.
Yes. So I would like to pose one last question before we get into closing remarks from the panel. And this question comes from Zach Richardson. He asks,
hey, Zach.
What would the US government say about these float houses, and would the government tax them? What do you think will be the initial attitude, and perhaps the attitude as it evolves over time from governmental authorities?
I think the structure, if you saw it today, looks unconventional, but it looks like a sailboat with the top put down. It's almost like every boat out there is a convertible, and we're creating a car that's closed up. And that's kind of how I look at it. It's kind of funny to me like that. It's like we all got in this scenario of building boats that all look like convertibles, and there's almost no enclosed boats unless you look at like private yachts and stuff like that. But I think they'll be received as a kind of boat, or a kind of houseboat. I don't call them houseboats because houseboats aren't designed to survive on the open ocean. That's why I came up with the Floathouse name. So that's my dividing line between those. And I think that the US government will treat them as real property, in the sense that boats are currently treated as property that is taxed. So if you're a US citizen, you're buying it as a boat, and they're going to tax it as a boat for sure. But if you want to avoid that, the way that they avoid that currently is they say, hey, come down to Mexico and I'll sell it to you in Mexico, and then you won't have to pay the US tax on it. So there's opportunities there, and hey, why not take advantage of that? Because that's further incentive to go out. Like if I'm going to sell you one of these, and I have a seastead that's already in international waters, I'm going to sell you one of these on a seastead. It's going to be the cheapest way for you to buy it, and you never have to bother the US authorities about it. And they can't do anything about it at that point if you're in international waters. So
yes, indeed, there can be some creativity brought to bear in making sure people get the most value out of their float house, and face the fewest restrictions or tax obligations. So thank you for spending 3 hours with us. Now, to conclude, we have our custom of going around with the remaining panelists and seeing if they have any final comments or questions or ideas from this event. And then it is our custom to let our guest have the last word. But now let us go to Art Ramon Garcia. Art Ramon, what are your thoughts?
No additional questions, but yeah, thank you for explaining it. I really got a lot out of it.
My pleasure.
Thank you for coming.
Absolutely, and I would like to echo that. Now let's go to David Shoemaker.
Yes, well, while we're echoing, I'll echo what Art had to say, and the fact that I very much appreciated this conversation. This is very interesting and not something that I've given a lot of thought to previously, but I think I will in the future. So thank you very much for that. I look forward to seeing how this unfolds and what this means for us as we move forward. So thanks very much.
Fantastic.
Yes, indeed. Now let us go to Alexandria Black. And Alexandria did say in the internal chat, it seems like we need to reform our admiralty laws. So if you would care to talk about that and anything else that comes to mind, Alexandria.
Just the legal foundations that we currently live under seem rather draconian and authoritarian. And I know that we're trying to move away from that and find more freedom and agency to try new things. What else did I want to follow up? Oh, yes. Thanks so much for being here and teaching us so much. That's the best parts of Sunday for me. I always learn so much. And I hope we can follow up with you later on some things. I've been the admin of a robotics group for quite a while, and never mind, I don't have one robot, but we do have plenty of good discussions. So we'll follow up with you later then. Thank you.
For sure.
Excellent. And now, go ahead.
As far as admiralty laws and all that, I will just add one thing, that one of the legal strategies that the seasteading community is pursuing is kind of like getting a grant or a new concept going for ocean sea zones. I know Tom W. Bell is a great innovator in the seasteading community. He's like the leading legal seasteading lawyer. That's a mouthful. But Tom W. Bell is great. He's written books on, he wrote a book called Your Next Government, which is on YouTube. I'm sorry, it's on Amazon, which is great. And so he's also interested in these exact same things of how we reform legally and deal with non-state systems. But he's also been a legal innovator on special economic zones for the ocean, what he calls the sea zones. And this is something that came out of Tahiti, where they did a lot of work on the sea zone concept of trying to get for seasteads the same kind of legal allowances that cruise ships have, because cruise ships are considered basically independent entities, even though they're within certain regional waters. And essentially what seasteads want to do is basically what cruise ships are already doing, just full time. So it's like cruise ships have, in a sense, led the way, and we can piggyback on their success.
Yes, and it's interesting. Yes, in just a moment, Alexandria, I wanted to point out Tom W. Bell is one of the co-founders of the extropian school of thought in transhumanism. He wrote under the pseudonym Tom Morrow, or T.O. Morrow, with Max Moore. So they co-wrote the philosophy of extropy. But go ahead, Alexandria.
Sure. I think that the legal foundations we are setting right now are going to be so important to future spacefarers. That's why I keep bringing up things like admiralty law.
So one thing we can do is if we, and it's really the Seasteading Institute taking the lead on this, where they will behind the scenes go to a friendly country and say, hey, can you make this kind of law for the ocean? And we will fly your flag. So when you on the ocean, you have a choice of whose flag you're going to fly, and that determines what laws are really operative on that structure. And so by making a friendly nation like that and asking them for that kind of allowance, we could, in a sense, pit laws against each other and get favorable laws to start with before we can really run out on our own. So that's something they're working on also.
Yes, indeed. Now let us see if Pavel Ilin is available to make a comment. He says, Michael, thank you very much for coming here. Looking forward to see how we can solve housing problems by inhabiting the seas and experimenting with societal organizations. So thank you, Pavel, for those remarks. And now it has come to the time when we will have our guest offer the concluding remarks for this virtual Enlightenment Salon. What would you like to say with regard to this conversation? What are your impressions of it? And is there anything you would like to add?
I just want to say, first of all, that I really love this long format where we can really dig into the meat of the issues. And I appreciate you guys giving me this opportunity to speak to you and everyone in the transhumanist community. I didn't mention it here, but I'm a moderator on Reddit of our transhumanism also, and very much enjoy these concepts. Also our singularity, we did mention that too. But yeah, I'm right there with you guys, and I wish you the best of luck in what you guys are doing as well. And I think if we all succeed together, then we all succeed together. So just thank you for the time and the questions and the interest, and I appreciate you guys.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for joining us today, Michael, and I hope our audience has been able to observe many ways in which seasteading is an integral area within transhumanism, an area we hope to see develop and expand in the years and decades to come. And next Sunday, which will be January 24th, I'm pleased to announce we're going to have a virtual Enlightenment Salon on virtual reality. Our friend Sever gave a great presentation at the H+ Academy earlier today, and he is going to provide an enhanced version of that presentation with visuals about the virtual reality technologies that have very recently become available, and the progress in this area has been astonishing. So that is something to look forward to. And in the meantime, thank you everyone for attending. Thank you, Michael. Thank you to our panel. Thank you to our YouTube audience and everyone watching the recorded version of this salon. And until next week, live long and prosper.